The first scream came at midnight, muffled, desperate, clawing through the frozen Colorado darkness like a living thing. Caleb Hart had been in town exactly 8 hours when he heard it. 8 hours since stepping off that rust-stained train with nothing but a deed to land he'd never seen and the bone-deep certainty that his old life was finally, mercifully dead. He'd come to this brutal corner of 1882 Colorado to disappear, to start clean. But that sound, raw and terrified and unmistakably human, shattered any illusion of peace before he could even unpack his worn saddlebag. Welcome to a story of darkness and deliverance, where one man's fresh start collides with another's nightmare. Stay with me until the very end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story reaches across the world. The October wind cut through Caleb's threadbare coat like a promise of the brutal winter to come. He stood in the doorway of what was now, somehow, his. A weathered ranch house that leaned slightly to the west, as if tired of standing upright. The real estate agent back in Denver had called it a property of great potential, which Caleb now understood was Eastern code for falling apart but not yet condemned. Still, it was his. Bought with 3 years of wages saved from breaking horses on ranches that worked him dawn to dusk and asked no questions about the ghosts in his eyes, the kind of places where men arrived with one name and left, if they lived, with another. Caleb was 24 and looked older. The frontier had a way of adding years to a man's face while stealing them from his future. His hands were scarred from rope and leather, his shoulders broad from work that never ended, and his expression carried the particular weariness of someone who'd seen enough of humanity's ugliness to know that peace was something you fought for, not something you found. The house itself was small, 3 rooms and a stone fireplace that looked like it had been built by someone who actually knew what they were doing. The roof needed patching. The barn door hung crooked on rusted hinges. The fences were more gap than rail. But there was land, 30 acres of it, stretching toward the mountains that rose like broken teeth against the darkening sky. And there was that other house. Caleb had noticed it immediately when he'd arrived that afternoon, exhausted and dust-covered from the 2-day journey from Denver. The neighboring estate sprawled across the next property like something transplanted from a different world entirely. A 2-story Victorian painted dark green, with wraparound porches and gingerbread trim that seemed absurdly delicate against the rough Colorado landscape. Behind it stood a proper barn, a carriage house, and what looked like workers' quarters, though Caleb had seen no workers. In fact, he'd seen no one at all. No smoke from the chimneys despite the dropping temperature. No horses in the paddock. No light in any window as the sun set and shadows pooled in the valley like spilled ink. The place had the hollow feeling of abandonment, except for one detail that nagged at him. The grounds were immaculate, fences in perfect repair, gardens recently tended, firewood neatly stacked under tarps. Someone lived there. Someone with money and fastidious habits. And yet the silence that emanated from that grand house felt wrong. Not peaceful. Wrong. Like the held breath before a scream. Caleb had shaken off the thought, attributing it to exhaustion and the general unease that came with arriving in a strange place where you knew no one and nothing. He'd spent the afternoon hauling his few possessions inside, a trunk of clothes, his bedroll, a rifle, a few books his mother had insisted he take before she died. The essentials of a life that could fit in a single wagon. By the time darkness fell completely, he'd managed to start a fire in the fireplace, heat some beans and hardtack for dinner, and spread his bedroll on the floor near the warmth. The bed frame in the single bedroom was broken, another repair added to the endless list. He'd tackle it tomorrow, along with everything else that needed fixing. Sleep had come quickly, dragged down by bone-deep fatigue. And then, at midnight, the scream. Caleb jolted awake with his hand already reaching for the rifle propped against the wall. His heart hammered as he oriented himself. The dying fire, the unfamiliar shadows, the reality that he was alone in a house he barely knew in a town where he had no allies. The sound came again. Not a scream this time, but close, a muffled cry, desperate and terrified, like someone trying to shout through a gag or from behind a closed door. The sound of a woman in distress, fighting against something or someone. And it was coming from the direction of that too-quiet house next door. Caleb was on his feet before conscious thought caught up with instinct. He shoved his feet into boots, grabbed his rifle and the lantern, and stepped out into a night so cold it burned his lungs. Frost already glittered on the grass, turning the world silver white under a moon that hung like a watchful eye. He paused, listening. Nothing but wind and the distant yipping of coyotes in the hills. Then, there, faint but unmistakable. A sound that might have been sobbing or pleading, raw with fear and exhaustion. Caleb moved quickly across the frost-stiffened field that separated his property from the neighboring estate, his breath fogging in the frigid air. The rifle felt heavy in his hands, a familiar weight that had saved his life twice before. The lantern swung as he walked, casting wild shadows that danced across the frozen ground. The grand house loomed ahead, dark and forbidding. No lights, no movement. But the sound was definitely coming from here, somewhere behind the main structure. He circled the building, boots crunching on gravel that had been carefully raked into perfect lines. The back of the property opened onto a sloping yard that led down toward a creek he could hear but not see. Outbuildings formed dark shapes against the star-scattered sky. The crying had stopped. Caleb froze, listening so hard his ears ached. Had he imagined it? Was this some trick of the wind, some acoustic peculiarity of this valley that made normal sounds seem a thump, deliberate, rhythmic, bang, bang, bang? Someone was hitting something, or hitting something against something. Desperate, measured blows that spoke of determination rather than rage. Caleb followed the sound to a structure he'd initially mistaken for a storm cellar or root storage. A wooden door set at an angle into the ground near the back corner of the property, partially hidden by overgrown bushes that hadn't been trimmed with the same obsessive care as the rest of the grounds. The lantern light caught on metal, a chain, new, heavy gauge, wrapped multiple times around the door handles and secured with a padlock that gleamed like it had been purchased yesterday. This wasn't storage. This was a cage. "Hello?" Caleb called, his voice carrying in the thin night air. "Is someone down there?" The banging stopped immediately. A moment of absolute silence, and then a voice, hoarse, thin, breaking with desperation. "Please, please, whoever you are, please help me." A woman, young from the sound of it, and terrified beyond measure. Caleb's mind raced. This was wrong in every way that mattered. People didn't chain cellar doors from the outside unless they were keeping something, someone, inside. But he was new here, knew nothing about local disputes or family matters or the thousand complicated reasons people in small towns did incomprehensible things to each other. And yet, that voice, the terror in it, the pleading. "I'm going to get you out," he called. "Step back from the door if you can." He set the lantern down and examined the lock. Good quality, expensive, the kind merchants used on their most valuable inventory. The chain was wrapped 4 times around the handles, securing them so tightly that even without the lock, it would be nearly impossible to force the doors open from inside. Whoever had done this had wanted to make absolutely certain their prisoner couldn't escape. Caleb didn't have tools to cut the chain or pick the lock. What he had was a rifle and righteous anger building in his chest like a fire catching in dry kindling. He stepped back, raised the rifle, and aimed carefully at the lock's shank. "Cover your ears and get as far back as you can," he shouted. The shot exploded through the night, deafening in the cold silence. The lock shattered, pieces of metal singing off into the darkness. The chain went slack. Somewhere in the main house, a dog started barking, high and frantic, like it had been shocked awake by the gunshot. But no lights appeared. No one came running. Caleb unwrapped the chain with hands that shook slightly, not from cold, but from the growing realization of what he was uncovering. He pulled the doors open. The smell hit him first. Unwashed bodies, human waste, sickness, and beneath it all, the earthy scent of a space that had been sealed too long. The lantern light spilled down wooden steps into a cellar that should have held preserves and potatoes. Instead, it held a girl. She huddled in the far corner, one arm raised against the sudden light, her dress, what remained of it, hanging in filthy tatters. Her hair was matted and dark, her face so thin that her bones seemed to press against skin that had taken on an unhealthy pallor. She looked like something barely human, like a ghost of a person, all hollow eyes and trembling limbs. It's all right, Caleb said, keeping his voice as gentle as he could manage past the fury building in his throat. I'm here to help. Can you walk? She stared at him with eyes that had seen too much darkness, literally and metaphorically. For a long moment she didn't move, and Caleb wondered if she'd been down there so long that freedom had become incomprehensible. Then she nodded, a tiny, fragile movement, and tried to stand. Her legs buckled immediately. Caleb descended the steps quickly, setting the lantern aside and reaching for her. She flinched violently at his approach, pressing back against the stone wall. I won't hurt you, he said, stopping. But you need help. Medical help, food, warmth. Let me carry you out of here. You're not... Her voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. You're not him. No. I'm your neighbor. I just moved in today. My name is Caleb Hart. She studied his face in the lamplight, searching for something. Lies, cruelty, the particular violence that had put her in this hole. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she gave another small nod. Elena? She whispered. Elena Mercer. Caleb moved slowly, telegraphing every motion, and carefully lifted her. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of bones and terror wrapped in rags. He could feel her shaking, could hear her breathing in short, panicked gasps as he carried her up the stairs into the open air. She turned her face toward the sky and started crying, silent tears that tracked through the dirt on her cheeks. How long? Caleb asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. I've lost count. Weeks. Maybe 2 months. Her voice was hoarse from disuse, or screaming, or both. He stopped coming. Stopped bringing food or water. I thought I was going to die down there. Who did this to you? My stepfather, Vernon Hale. The name meant nothing to Caleb, but the way she said it, with a mixture of hatred and bone-deep fear, told him everything he needed to know about the man who owned that grand, silent house. He carried Elena across the frosted field to his own humble ranch, acutely aware of how exposed they were, how visible in the moonlight. If this Vernon Hale returned, if he saw his prisoner being stolen by the new neighbor, but the house behind them remained dark and quiet. The dog had stopped barking. Inside his own home, Caleb laid Elena on his bedroll near the fire and quickly built up the flames. She curled into a ball, still shaking, her eyes darting around the unfamiliar space with the wariness of a trapped animal, expecting the cage door to slam shut again at any moment. I'm going to get you some water, Caleb said, and food, if you think you can keep it down. Then we need to figure out what to do. The sheriff, Elena said quickly, desperately. He'll help. He has to help. Something in her tone suggested she didn't quite believe her own words. Caleb pumped water from his well, heated some on the fire, and brought her a cup. She drank it so fast she choked, and he had to slow her down, make her take smaller sips. He warmed beans and found a crust of bread that was only slightly stale, and watched as she ate with the desperate intensity of someone who'd been starving. While she ate, he stoked the fire higher and tried to think through the implications of what he'd just done. He'd cut a man's lock, broken into what was technically private property, and taken what the law might consider someone's legal dependent. Never mind that the someone had been imprisoned in a cellar and left to die. In the eyes of the law, particularly in small frontier towns where money talked louder than justice, he might have just made himself a criminal. But looking at Elena's hollow face and trembling hands, he couldn't regret it. Tell me what happened, he said gently. From the beginning. Elena set down the empty bowl and wrapped her arms around herself, staring into the fire. When she spoke, her voice was flat, mechanical, the tone of someone reciting a nightmare they'd lived through too many times to feel it anymore. My mother married Vernon when I was 14. She died 6 months later, fever. After that, it was just him and me in that big house. She paused, swallowing hard. He's a businessman, imports, exports, mining investments. Rich. Respected. Everyone in town thinks he's generous and civic-minded because he donates to the church and sponsors the Harvest Festival. But he's not. No. The word came out like a hiss. He's cruel, controlling. He liked that my mother was beautiful and refined, but once she was gone, he saw me as property. an asset to be managed and eventually sold. Caleb felt his jaw tighten. 3 months ago, one of his business associates came to visit. Edgar Thorne, 50 years old, widowed, looking for a young wife to run his household and produce children. Vernon offered me like I was livestock, said I'd marry Edgar within the month, and you refused. I told him I'd rather die. Elena's laugh was bitter and broken, so he made sure I almost did. Dragged me down to that cellar, chained the door, told me I'd stay there until I came to my senses, and agreed to the marriage. Said a few days without food and light would make me more reasonable. But a few days turned into weeks. He'd come every few days at first, bring just enough food and water to keep me alive, lecture me about obedience and duty and knowing my place. Then his visits got less frequent. The last time I saw him was, I don't know, a week ago, maybe more. He said he was going to Denver on business, and he'd decide what to do with me when he got back. Her voice cracked. I thought he'd decided to just let me die, that he'd gotten tired of the whole situation and figured it was easier to tell everyone I'd run away or met with some accident. Caleb wanted to say something comforting, something that would make the horror of what she'd endured less real. But there were no words adequate to that task, so he settled for practical action instead. You're safe now, he said firmly. Tomorrow we'll go to the sheriff. Tell him everything. Vernon Hale will answer for what he did. Elena looked at him with eyes that held no hope at all. You don't understand. Vernon is one of the most powerful men in this county. He has friends in Denver, connections to the territorial governor. The sheriff... She trailed off, shaking her head. The sheriff won't touch him, not without proof that can't be explained away. You're the proof, your testimony. The word of a hysterical girl against a respected businessman. They'll say I'm ungrateful, that I ran away and invented stories to justify my disobedience. Vernon will say he was protecting me from myself, that the cellar was for my own safety during one of my episodes. She said the word with savage mockery. He's already been laying the groundwork, telling people I've been acting strangely since my mother died, that he's worried about my mental state. Caleb felt something cold and hard settling in his chest, the recognition that the evil in the world wasn't always dramatic or obvious. Sometimes it wore expensive suits and went to church on Sundays and knew exactly how to use the systems of law and society to its own advantage. Then we'll find another way, he said. There is no other way. I'm not yet 18. By law, he's my guardian until I marry or come of age. He can do whatever he wants with me and call it discipline or protection or tough love, and no one will stop him. They sat in silence for a long moment, the fire crackling and popping, casting dancing shadows on the rough walls. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the corners of the little house like something wild and hungry. Finally, Caleb spoke. How long until you turn 18? 8 months. 8 months, an eternity when you were waiting for freedom, and far too long to expect Vernon Hale to simply accept that his property had escaped and his authority had been challenged by some nobody cowboy who'd just arrived in town. All right, Caleb said. Then you stay here, with me. I'll protect you until you're of age, and then you'll be free to make your own choices. Elena stared at him like he'd just proposed something insane. You can't. You don't know what Vernon is capable of. He'll destroy you. He'll use the law, his money, his influence. He'll bury you so deep you'll never see daylight again. Let him try. Why? The question burst from her with desperate confusion. Why would you risk everything for someone you don't even know? You just got here. You have your own life to build. This isn't your fight. Caleb looked at her, really looked at this broken, brave girl who'd survived weeks in a hole in the ground and still had the strength to warn him away from danger. And he thought about all the times in his own life when he'd needed help and found only indifference, all the moments when someone could have intervened and chosen not to because it wasn't their problem, wasn't their business, wasn't worth the risk. Maybe it should be, he said simply. Maybe that's what being neighbors means. Elena's face crumpled. She pressed her hands to her mouth, trying to hold back sobs that shook her whole body. Caleb looked away, giving her what privacy he could in the small space, and wondered what the hell he'd just gotten himself into. But even as the question formed, he knew the answer. He'd gotten himself into exactly the kind of fight that mattered, The kind where doing nothing would have cost him something far more valuable than safety or money or reputation. It would have cost him the ability to look at himself in the mirror. Tomat. Elena slept fitfully that night, curled in Caleb's bedroll while he kept watch in a chair by the fire, rifle across his knees. She woke several times with muffled cries, disoriented and terrified, and each time Caleb spoke quietly until she remembered where she was and that she was safe, or as safe as either of them could be with Vernon Hale's shadow hanging over everything. Dawn came slowly, the sky lightening from black to gray to pale gold. Caleb watched through the window as his land emerged from darkness, the broken fences, the sagging barn, the endless work waiting. In the distance, the neighboring estate remained quiet and dark, but now he knew the malignancy that lived there, the cruelty hidden behind Victorian gingerbread and carefully tended gardens. Elena woke as the sun cleared the mountains. She sat up slowly, wincing, every movement clearly painful after weeks of confinement. In the morning light, Caleb could see just how much damage had been done. She was painfully thin, her skin marked with bruises in various stages of healing, her wrists raw from what must have been attempts to free herself from the chains. "I need to get you cleaned up," he said, "and find you proper clothes. Then we need to make a plan." "A plan for what?" Elena's voice was hoarse. "I told you, there's no legal recourse. Vernon controls everything." "Maybe, but he doesn't control you anymore. That's got to count for something." He heated water on the stove and found a clean shirt of his own that would serve as a makeshift dress. It hung on her like a tent, but it was better than the rags she'd been wearing. He turned his back while she washed and changed, giving her what dignity he could. When she was done, she looked slightly more human, though her eyes still held that hunted, desperate quality of someone who'd learned that safety was an illusion that could be ripped away at any moment. "I can't pay you," she said quietly, "for helping me. I have nothing. I'm not asking for payment. Everyone asks for something eventually." The cynicism in her voice, so young and already so worn down, made something ache in Caleb's chest. "Not everyone," he said. "Some people just do the right thing because it's right." She looked at him skeptically, but didn't argue. They spent the morning talking strategy. Elena was intelligent and surprisingly practical once the initial shock and terror began to wear off. She knew Vernon's habits, his business schedule, his social obligations. She knew he'd been planning to return from Denver today or tomorrow, which meant they had hours at most before he discovered her escape. "He'll come here first," Elena said with certainty. "He's methodical. He'll check the cellar, find it broken open, and search the immediate area. Your house is the closest property. He'll assume you're involved." "Good. Let him come. I'll tell him exactly where you are, under my protection." "Caleb." She said his name like he was a child who didn't understand fire was hot. "He will ruin you. He'll claim you kidnapped me, that you're holding me against my will. The sheriff will believe him because Vernon pays his salary. You'll be arrested, possibly hanged if he pushes hard enough. And I'll be right back in that cellar, or somewhere worse." "Not if we get married." The words hung in the air between them like something physical. Elena stared at him. "What?" "You said yourself, the only way you're free of his guardianship is if you marry. So we get married, today, if possible. Then Vernon has no legal claim over you at all." "That's insane." "Maybe, but it works. You can't just marry someone you met 12 hours ago. Why not? People out here do it all the time. Mail-order brides, frontier proposals, marriages of convenience. It's not exactly uncommon." Elena shook her head, but he could see her mind working, turning over the idea, examining it from all angles. "Even if I agreed, which I'm not saying I am, it would take time. We'd need a license, a preacher, witnesses." "The county clerk opens at 8. We can get a license this morning and find a preacher by afternoon. Vernon won't be back until evening at the earliest." Caleb leaned forward, his expression serious. "I know it's fast. I know it's not how either of us imagined getting married. But it's a solution, a legal one that Vernon can't touch." "And then what? We're stuck married to each other for the rest of our lives?" "No. We get an annulment after you turn 18 if that's what you want. Or we stay married in name only. I'll sign papers giving you complete freedom to live your own life." "This isn't about controlling you, Elena. It's about making sure no one else can either." She was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire that had burned down to coals. Outside, the sound of a wagon passing on the distant road reminded them both that the world was waking up. The time was moving forward whether they were ready or not. "Why would you do this?" she asked finally. "Risk everything. Tie yourself to a stranger, make yourself a target for a powerful man's revenge. Why?" Caleb thought about how to answer that. How to explain that some decisions weren't made with logic or careful calculation, but with the part of you that knew, bone deep, what was right and what was wrong, and that the space between the two was where character lived. "Because I heard you screaming in the dark," he said simply, "and I couldn't walk away." Elena looked at him with eyes that were starting to believe, not in fairy tales or rescue fantasies, but in something more fragile and more real. The possibility that someone might help without demanding payment, that kindness might exist without cruelty hidden underneath. "If we do this," she said slowly, "it's a partnership, not you saving me. I pull my weight. I help with the ranch, with whatever needs doing. I'm not going to be some helpless thing you have to take care of. I wouldn't want you to be. And when I turn 18, we reassess, figure out what makes sense for both of us." Agreed. She took a deep breath, and Caleb could see her gathering courage the way a person might gather weapons before a battle. "All right then. Let's go get married before I come to my senses." The town of Cedar Ridge was small even by frontier standards. One main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a church, a general store, a saloon, and the combination courthouse and sheriff's office that served as the seat of local government. The population couldn't have been more than 300 souls, most of them scattered across the surrounding ranches and mining claims. Caleb and Elena rode in together on his horse, her sitting behind him because he had no wagon yet. She'd wrapped herself in his spare coat and pulled the collar up to hide her face, though whether from shame or fear of being recognized, Caleb couldn't tell. The county clerk was a thin man with spectacles and the officious manner of someone who took great pride in paperwork. He looked up when they entered, his expression shifting from bored to curious as he took in Elena's obvious youth and Caleb's rough frontier appearance. "Help you?" he asked. "We need a marriage license," Caleb said. The clerk's eyebrows rose. "Both of you? Together? That's generally how marriage works." "Right. Well, I'll need some information. Names, ages, current residence." They provided the information, Caleb watching Elena carefully to make sure she was holding up under the scrutiny. She answered the questions in a quiet but steady voice, giving her name as Elena Mercer and her age as 17, which made the clerk frown slightly. "You have parental consent?" he asked. "Her parents are dead," Caleb said smoothly. "She's been living with her stepfather, but since we're marrying, his consent isn't required." This was technically true, if misleadingly presented. The clerk looked like he wanted to ask more questions, but ultimately seemed to decide that frontier marriages were strange enough that this barely registered as unusual. "There's a 3-day waiting period. We'll pay extra to waive it," Caleb said, placing bills on the counter. "Family emergency. We need to be married today." Money talked. The clerk hesitated only a moment before pocketing the bills and pulling out a different form. "I'll need both of you to sign here, and you'll need witnesses for the ceremony." "Where can we find a preacher?" "Reverend Matthews lives above the church. He can marry you, but he'll want to counsel you first, especially given the lady's age." "We'll talk to him." They left the clerk's office with the license folded carefully in Caleb's pocket and walked the 2 blocks to the white clapboard church that stood at the edge of town. It was a simple building, well-maintained but modest, with a cross mounted above the door and the kind of quiet dignity that spoke of genuine faith rather than social performance. Reverend Matthews turned out to be a surprise. A black man in his 50s with silver threading through his hair and eyes that looked at them with a combination of wisdom and kindness that made Elena relax slightly. "You want to be married?" he said after they had explained their situation. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," Caleb said. "Today. If possible." The Reverend looked at Elena. "Child, do you come here of your own free will?" "I do." "Are you being coerced or forced in any way?" "No, I want this." Her voice was stronger now. "I need this." Something in her tone must have communicated the desperation underneath, because the Reverend's expression softened. Come inside. Let's talk. They spent an hour in his small office while he asked questions, gentle but probing, designed to ensure that what they were doing was legal and moral and wouldn't cause more harm than good. Elena, to her credit, was honest. She didn't tell him about the cellar, but she told him about Vernon's cruelty, about the forced engagement, about her need to escape a situation that was becoming dangerous. The Reverend listened without interrupting, his hands folded on his desk, his face grave. When she finished, he looked at Caleb. And you're willing to take on this responsibility? To bind yourself to this young woman and all the consequences that will follow? I am. You understand that marriage is a sacred covenant, not a legal trick? I understand that sometimes the right thing and the legal thing are the same. This is one of those times. The Reverend was quiet for a moment, studying them both. Then he nodded. I'll marry you, but I want your word that you'll treat this marriage with the respect it deserves, even if it began from necessity. The vows you speak today will matter, whether you believe in their permanence or not. You have my word, Caleb said. And mine, Elena added. Then let's find you some witnesses and make this official. The witnesses turned out to be the Reverend's wife, a kind-faced woman who immediately took Elena under her wing, and the church caretaker, an elderly man who seemed delighted to be part of a wedding, even one as hastily arranged as this. They stood in the church's small sanctuary, light streaming through plain glass windows, and spoke words that had been spoken by countless couples before them. Words about love and honor and permanence, about choosing each other in sickness and health, for better or worse. Caleb meant every word, even knowing they might part ways in 8 months. Because in this moment, he was choosing to protect this woman, to give her shelter and safety and the legal shield that would keep her free. That was a kind of love, even if it wasn't romance. Elena's voice shook when she repeated the vows, but she didn't falter. She looked at Caleb with something like gratitude and something like hope, and when the Reverend pronounced them married, she didn't pull away when Caleb gently took her hand. They signed the marriage certificate, the witnesses added their names, and it was done. Elena Hart was no longer Elena Mercer, ward of Vernon Hale. She was free. They walked out of the church into afternoon sunlight that felt almost celebratory, warm and golden despite the October chill. The Reverend's wife had pressed a small wrapped package into Elena's hands. A little something for starting your new life, and the caretaker had clapped Caleb on the shoulder with gruff congratulations. Thank you, Elena said as they walked toward where Caleb had tied the horse. For everything. I know you gave up a lot. I gave up nothing that mattered, Caleb said, and gained a partner, if that's all right with you. She smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and it transformed her face entirely. A partner sounds good. They were halfway back to the ranch when they saw the carriage on the road ahead. Black lacquered wood, pulled by matched horses, expensive and ostentatious against the rough frontier landscape. And driving it, his face like a thundercloud, was a man Caleb instinctively knew could only be Vernon Hale. Elena went rigid behind him, her hands tightening on his waist. That's him, she whispered. Oh God, that's him. Vernon pulled the carriage to a stop in the middle of the road, blocking their path. He was a man in his 50s, well-dressed in city clothes that looked absurd out here, with silver hair and features that might have been handsome if they hadn't been twisted with arrogance and barely contained fury. Elena, he said, his voice carrying across the distance between them. Get away from that man and come here immediately. No, Elena said. Her voice was small but defiant. Don't make this worse for yourself, girl. You've embarrassed me, damaged my property, and aligned yourself with a criminal. Come here now, and I might show you mercy. Caleb felt Elena trembling, but she didn't move to obey. Vernon's eyes narrowed. You, he said, focusing on Caleb. I don't know who you think you are or what you think you're doing, but you've made a grave mistake. That girl is my legal ward. By taking her, you've committed kidnapping. I can have you arrested within the hour. Elena isn't your ward anymore, Caleb said calmly. She's my wife. As of 2 hours ago, legally married in the church in town. You have no claim over her. For a moment, Vernon Hale looked like he'd been struck. His face went red, then white, his hands tightening on the reins until his knuckles went bloodless. That's impossible. She's 17. She needs my consent. She's 17 and married. The law doesn't require your consent once she's spoken her vows. Check with the county clerk if you don't believe me. The fury in Vernon's eyes was terrible to behold, the rage of a man who'd been outmaneuvered by people he considered beneath him. But underneath the anger, Caleb saw something else. Calculation. The mind of a man who never fought battles he couldn't win, who always found another angle, another lever, another way to bend the world to his will. This isn't over, Vernon said softly. Not even close. You've made an enemy today, Mr. Hart, and you have no idea what that means. He turned the carriage around in a thunder of hooves and wheels and drove away, leaving them standing in the road with dust settling around them and the terrible certainty that he'd meant every word of his threat. Elena was shaking so hard she could barely stay on the horse. Caleb reached back and steadied her, feeling the rapid flutter of her heartbeat against his back. It's all right, he said. He can't touch you now. You don't understand, Elena whispered. The cellar was just the beginning. When Vernon wants to destroy someone, he doesn't stop until there's nothing left. Caleb thought about the small ranch waiting for them, the work that needed doing, the life he'd hoped to build in this rough, beautiful place. And he thought about the young woman behind him who'd survived weeks in darkness and still had the courage to choose freedom over safety. Then he's going to learn something about frontier justice, Caleb said quietly. Out here, money and influence don't mean as much as people think. What matters is whether you can stand your ground when someone tries to take what's yours. I'm not yours, Elena said, but there was no heat in it, just the automatic assertion of someone who'd fought too long to be owned by anyone. No, Caleb agreed, you're your own. And that's exactly what we're going to make sure Vernon Hale understands. They rode the rest of the way home in silence, the mountains casting long shadows across the valley, and Caleb tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong, about the reality that he'd just made himself a target for a powerful man's revenge barely a day after arriving in town. But when they reached the ranch and Elena slid down from the horse, looking at the small weathered house like it was sanctuary, he knew he'd made the right choice. Some things were worth fighting for, and Elena's freedom was one of them. The first 3 days of their marriage passed in a strange, quiet rhythm that felt both temporary and permanent at the same time. Caleb worked the land from dawn until his hands bled, mending fences, patching the barn roof, chopping firewood for the winter that was coming fast and hard. Elena worked beside him, insisting despite her weakened state, her movements slow but determined as she helped stack wood, feed the few chickens that had come with the property, and organize the chaos of a house that had been abandoned too long. They didn't talk much during those first days. Words felt dangerous, too heavy with implications about what they'd done and why and what it meant for the future. Instead, they communicated through the simple language of shared work. Caleb steadying the ladder while Elena cleaned the stovepipe, Elena handing him nails while he repaired the broken bed frame, both of them moving around each other in the small space with the careful choreography of people learning to coexist. At night, Elena slept in the bedroom, while Caleb took his bedroll by the fire. The arrangement was never discussed, simply implemented with the unspoken understanding that whatever legal bond they'd created, it didn't extend to intimacy neither of them wanted or were ready for. On the fourth day, Vernon Hale made his first move. It started with the banker. Caleb had ridden into Cedar Ridge to purchase supplies, nails, flour, coffee, kerosene, the essentials that would get them through the next few weeks. He'd left Elena at the ranch with the rifle and strict instructions to shoot first and ask questions later if Vernon appeared. She'd looked terrified but resolute, and Caleb had hated leaving her alone even for a few hours. The general store owner, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Patterson, had been perfectly pleasant until Caleb mentioned he wanted to establish credit for future purchases. "I'm afraid I can't do that," she'd said, her smile tight and uncomfortable. "Why not? I own property here. I can provide references from Denver." "It's not that, Mr. Hart. It's just, well, there's been talk about your situation, and Mr. Hale is a very important customer of mine. I can't afford to offend him." The message was clear. Vernon was already using his influence to isolate them, to make it harder for Caleb to do business in town, to survive. Caleb had paid cash for his supplies and left without argument, Fighting with Mrs. Patterson wouldn't change anything, and it would only give Vernon the satisfaction of knowing his tactics were working. The banker was next. Caleb had stopped at the Cedar Ridge Savings and Loan to inquire about a small loan. Nothing major, just enough to buy proper tools and maybe a few head of cattle to start building his herd. The banker, a thin man with nervous eyes named Cornelius Webb, had listened to his request with increasing discomfort. "I'm afraid I can't approve a loan at this time," Webb had said, shuffling papers on his desk without meeting Caleb's eyes. "Can I ask why not? I have land as collateral." "It's not about collateral, Mr. Hart. It's about, well, character. And there are questions about your character." "Questions from whom?" Webb's silence was answer enough. "Vernon Hale," Caleb said flatly. "Mr. Hale is one of our largest depositors. He's also a member of the bank's board of directors. When he expresses concerns about an individual's fitness for credit, we have to take those concerns seriously." "What concerns exactly?" "That you're a drifter with no established history in the community, that you coerced a vulnerable young woman into a hasty marriage for purposes of gaining access to her potential inheritance, that you may have criminal associations we're not aware of." Webb finally looked up, his expression apologetic but firm. "I'm sure these allegations are untrue, Mr. Hart, but until the matter is resolved, I cannot extend credit." Caleb had wanted to argue, to point out that Elena had no inheritance and that the only criminal in this scenario was the man who'd locked a girl in a cellar, but arguing wouldn't change the fundamental reality. Vernon owned this town in all the ways that mattered, and he was going to use that ownership to squeeze them until they broke. "Understood," Caleb had said quietly. "Good day, Mr. Webb." He'd ridden home slowly, thinking through their options. They had enough cash for maybe 2 months if they were careful. The ranch could be self-sufficient eventually. There was good grazing land, water from the creek, enough space for a garden come spring. But getting to that point required tools and supplies and time, all of which required money they didn't have and couldn't borrow. Elena was waiting on the porch when he returned, the rifle across her knees, her face tight with anxiety that loosened only slightly when she saw him. "Any trouble?" she asked. "Not the kind you're thinking." Caleb dismounted and began unloading supplies. "But Vernon's making his presence felt. The store owner won't extend credit. The banker won't give me a loan. I'd wager the other merchants in town will follow suit soon enough." Elena's expression went dark. "He's trying to starve us out, make it impossible for you to keep the ranch, force you to sell and move on." "That's the idea." "And me?" "He probably figures once I'm gone, you'll have nowhere to turn. You'll come back to him because you'll have no choice." "I'd rather die." The words were said with such quiet conviction that Caleb believed her absolutely. This was a woman who'd survived weeks in a cellar rather than submit to a forced marriage. Starvation would be preferable to surrendering her freedom. "It won't come to that," Caleb said. "We'll find a way." "How?" "Vernon controls everything, the bank, the merchants, probably the sheriff too. Without credit or loans, how do we survive the winter?" It was a good question, and Caleb didn't have a good answer. But before he could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew both their attention to the road. 3 riders. The sheriff in the center, flanked by 2 deputies, all of them wearing expressions that suggested this wasn't a social call. "Stay behind me," Caleb said quietly, setting down the supplies and positioning himself between Elena and the approaching lawmen. The sheriff was a thick-bodied man in his 40s with a mustache that drooped past his jowls and eyes that held the particular wariness of someone who'd seen too much frontier violence. His name was Coleman, and he dismounted with the slow deliberation of a man who didn't want to be here but had no choice. "Mr. Hart," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "I need to have a word with you and your wife." The pause before wife was deliberate and insulting. "Say what you came to say, Sheriff," Caleb replied evenly. Coleman pulled a folded document from his coat. "I have here a complaint filed by Mr. Vernon Hale alleging that you coerced his ward, Miss Elena Mercer, into an unlawful marriage through threats and intimidation. He's requesting that the marriage be annulled and that Miss Mercer be returned to his custody pending a full investigation." "That's a lie," Elena said, stepping forward despite Caleb's attempt to keep her behind him. "Every word of it. I married Caleb of my own free will. Vernon is the one who should be investigated. For false imprisonment, for abuse, for..." That's a serious accusation, miss, Coleman interrupted. Do you have proof? The cellar. Go look at the cellar on Vernon's property. You'll find evidence, the chains, the lock Caleb shot open, the conditions I was kept in. Mr. Hale has already addressed that. He says the cellar is indeed secured because it contains valuable wine and other goods that needed protection. He claims you were never imprisoned there, that you've invented this story to justify running away. That's not true. He also has a letter from Dr. Harrison in Denver expressing concern about your mental state following your mother's death. The doctor recommended rest and careful supervision, which Mr. Hale was attempting to provide when you disappeared. Elena's face went white. Vernon paid Dr. Harrison to write that. I was never his patient. I've never even met him. Coleman's expression suggested he'd heard similar claims before and found them unconvincing. Be that as it may, we have competing narratives here. Mr. Hale says one thing, you say another. Without independent evidence, it becomes a question of credibility. And Vernon Hale is more credible than a 17-year-old girl, Caleb said, not bothering to hide his bitterness. Mr. Hale is a respected member of this community with no history of dishonesty. You, Mr. Hart, are a stranger who arrived less than a week ago and immediately involved yourself in a complicated family situation. Coleman's tone wasn't unkind, but it was firm. I'm not saying I believe him over you. I'm saying the law requires evidence, and right now all I have is accusations flying both directions. So what happens now? Caleb asked. Now I recommend you both come into town voluntarily to give statements. We'll sort this out proper-like, through legal channels. And if we refuse, Coleman's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his gun, then I have to consider that maybe Mr. Hale's allegations have merit, that maybe you are holding this young lady against her will. I'm not being held, Elena said desperately. I'm here because I want to be, because I'm safer here than I've ever been with Vernon. Then you'll have no objection to coming to town and saying so on the record, in front of witnesses. It was a trap, and they all knew it. If they refused, Coleman would have justification to arrest Caleb and take Elena by force. If they agreed, they'd be walking into Vernon's territory, surrounded by his influence, subjected to a legal process designed to favor money and power over truth. But they had no real choice. We'll come, Caleb said, but we're coming as husband and wife, with all the legal protections that entails. Elena is not Vernon Hale's property, and she's not going back to his custody under any circumstances. Coleman nodded slowly. Fair enough. Be in town tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock at the courthouse. Don't make me come back here, Mr. Hart. That won't end well for anyone. The sheriff and his deputies rode away, leaving Caleb and Elena standing in the yard with the certainty that Vernon's campaign against them was just beginning. That night, they sat by the fire and made plans. He's going to try to prove I'm unfit, Elena said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. He'll bring in that fake doctor's letter, maybe find other witnesses who'll say I was unstable or hysterical. He'll paint you as a fortune hunter who took advantage of a mentally incompetent girl. Then we need our own witnesses, people who can testify that you married me freely, that you're in your right mind. The Reverend and his wife, Elena said immediately. They spoke with us before the ceremony. They can confirm I wasn't coerced. And the county clerk who issued the license. He'll have records showing everything was legal and proper. Elena was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. It might not be enough. Vernon is very good at this, at using the system to get what he wants. He'll have lawyers, documents, people who owe him favors. We have nothing but the truth, and the truth doesn't always win. Then we make sure it does, Caleb said. We tell your story, all of it. What he did to you, why you married me, everything. We make it public, make it so ugly and damning that Vernon can't spin his way out of it. That's risky. If we accuse him publicly and can't prove it, he could sue us for slander. Take the ranch, everything you own. I don't own much, and what I do own isn't worth your freedom. Elena looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Something between gratitude and grief, like she wanted to believe in his selflessness, but couldn't quite let herself trust it. Why are you really doing this? She asked quietly. And don't say it's just about doing the right thing. Nobody risks everything for a stranger without a reason. Caleb thought about how to answer that, about the brother he'd failed to protect when they were children, about the guilt that had followed him from town to town, about the desperate need to prove that he could be the kind of man who stood up when it mattered instead of running away. But those were his ghosts, and Elena had enough of her own without carrying his too. "Because I heard you in the dark," he said simply. "And every time I close my eyes, I see that cellar and imagine what would have happened if I'd ignored it, if I'd decided it wasn't my business or convinced myself I'd misheard. You'd still be down there, alone and terrified, maybe dead by now. That would have been on me, even if the law said I had no obligation to help. So this is about your conscience. Maybe. Or maybe it's about becoming the kind of person I can stand to be." Elena was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was soft. "I'm glad you heard me. I'm glad you came. So am I." They sat in companionable silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts, until Elena finally stood and headed to the bedroom. She paused in the doorway, looking back at him. "Caleb? Yeah? Thank you for everything. I know I keep saying it, but I need you to know I mean it. I know you do." She disappeared into the bedroom, and Caleb sat alone with the fire, trying not to think about all the ways tomorrow could go wrong. Morning came too fast and too cold. Frost covered everything in crystalline white, and their breath fogged the air as they prepared to ride into town. Elena had found a dress in the trunk that had belonged to Caleb's mother, simple brown calico that fit reasonably well after some hasty adjustments. She'd washed her hair and braided it carefully, trying to look respectable and competent rather than like the half-starved prisoner she'd been less than a week ago. The transformation was remarkable. With proper food and rest, color had returned to her face, and the hollow desperation in her eyes had been replaced by something harder and more determined. She looked like a young woman who'd survived hell and come out fighting. They rode double again, Elena holding tight to Caleb's waist as they made the journey to Cedar Ridge. Other riders passed them on the road, ranchers heading to town for supplies, miners coming down from the hills, families in wagons. Some nodded politely. Others stared with open curiosity or hostility, depending on how much of Vernon's version of events they'd heard. The courthouse was a 2-story brick building that also housed the sheriff's office and the county clerk. A small crowd had already gathered outside. Townsfolk drawn by gossip and the promise of drama, lawyers and businessmen who had interests in the outcome, and a few genuine observers who wanted to see justice done properly. Vernon Hale stood on the courthouse steps, dressed in an expensive suit and surrounded by 3 men Caleb didn't recognize. Lawyers, probably, brought in from Denver to make sure this hearing went exactly the way Vernon wanted. When Vernon saw them approach, his expression shifted into something that might have been concern if his eyes hadn't been so cold. "Elena," he called out, his voice carrying across the crowd. "Thank God you're all right. I've been worried sick. Please, come here so we can talk privately before this hearing begins." Elena's hands tightened on Caleb's waist, but her voice when she spoke was clear and steady. "I have nothing to say to you privately, Vernon. Anything you want to say you can say in front of witnesses. Don't be difficult, child. You're confused. You've been through a traumatic experience. Let's handle this quietly, as a family." "You're not my family. You never were." Vernon's mask of concern slipped slightly, revealing the anger underneath. "I am your legal guardian and have been since your mother died. Everything I've done has been for your protection and well-being. You locked me in a cellar and starved me." The crowd's murmur rose in volume. Vernon's lawyers moved closer to him, one of them whispering urgently, but Vernon waved them away. "I secured certain areas of my property for safety reasons," he said loudly, addressing the crowd as much as Elena. "If you chose to trespass in dangerous areas against my explicit warnings, that's hardly my fault. And as for your wild accusations of abuse, Dr. Harrison's letter clearly documents your tendency toward hysteria and false narratives following your mother's death." "I never met Dr. Harrison. You paid him to write that letter." A serious accusation with no proof whatsoever. "Meanwhile, I have documentation, witnesses, and a history of responsible guardianship. What do you have? The word of a disturbed girl and the man who clearly took advantage of her vulnerability." Caleb dismounted and helped Elena down, positioning himself between her and Vernon's cold fury. "We have a legal marriage," he said quietly, "performed by Reverend Matthews, witnessed and recorded. Elena is my wife now, not your ward. Whatever claim you think you have over her ended the moment she spoke those vows. A marriage obtained through coercion and fraud is not valid, one of Vernon's lawyers interjected. We'll be arguing that the union should be annulled on grounds that Miss Mercer was not mentally competent to consent. I was perfectly competent, Elena snapped. More competent than when you tried to sell me to Edgar Thorne like I was livestock. The lawyer's expression didn't change. We have no record of any such arrangement. What we have is a pattern of increasingly erratic behavior from a young woman who lost her mother and subsequently fell under the influence of an opportunistic stranger. This was how it would go, Caleb realized. Vernon had prepared carefully, building a narrative that painted him as the concerned guardian and Elena as the unstable victim. Every truth she spoke would be reframed as delusion, every piece of evidence dismissed as fabrication or misunderstanding. Sheriff Coleman appeared in the courthouse doorway. All right, everyone inside, let's keep this orderly. Mr. Hale, Mr. Hart, Mr. Hart, and your respective counsel, please proceed to the hearing room. Everyone else, you can observe from the gallery if there's space, but I want silence and respect, or you're out. They filed into a room that was too small for the number of people trying to crowd inside. A judge's bench at the front, a few rows of seats for observers, tables for the opposing parties. It felt more like a trial than a hearing, and maybe that was intentional. Vernon using the weight and formality of the legal system to intimidate them into submission. The judge was a gray-haired man named Thornton, who looked at them all with weary skepticism, like he'd seen every variety of human foolishness and wasn't impressed by any of it. This is a preliminary hearing, he announced, to determine the validity of a marriage between Caleb Hart and Elena Mercer, now Elena Hart. Mr. Hale has petitioned for annulment on grounds that Miss Mercer was mentally incompetent at the time of the marriage and that Mr. Hart exercised undue influence. We'll hear testimony from both sides, and I'll make a determination based on the evidence presented. Mr. Hale, you filed the petition, so you'll present first. Vernon's lead lawyer, a slick man named Garrison who'd clearly done this 100 times before, stood and began laying out their case. He presented Dr. Harrison's letter describing Elena's supposed mental fragility. He called character witnesses who testified that Elena had seemed withdrawn and strange in the weeks before she disappeared. He painted a picture of a grieving, unstable girl who'd been taken advantage of by a calculating stranger. It was all lies, but it was presented with such confidence and backed by such carefully constructed documentation that Caleb could see some of the observers nodding along, convinced. Then Garrison called Vernon himself to testify. Vernon took the stand with the solemn demeanor of a man bearing a heavy burden. He spoke about his devotion to Elena's mother, his attempts to care for her daughter after she died, his growing concern about Elena's erratic behavior. She became obsessed with the idea that I was trying to control her, Vernon said, his voice heavy with false sadness. She accused me of terrible things, abuse, imprisonment, forced marriage. None of it was true, but I couldn't reason with her. Dr. Harrison recommended patience and supervision, which I tried to provide. But she ran away, and when I finally found her, she'd been convinced by this Mr. Hart that I was some kind of monster. And the cellar? Judge Thornton asked. Mrs. Hart has alleged she was imprisoned there. The cellar contains my wine collection and other valuable items. It's secured with chains and locks to prevent theft. If Elena wandered down there and found herself locked in, which I highly doubt happened, it would have been because she was trespassing in areas of my property I'd explicitly forbidden her to enter. It was a masterful performance. Vernon managed to sound both concerned and wounded, reasonable and regretful. He was painting himself as the victim of a disturbed girl's fantasies and a con man's schemes. When Garrison finished with Vernon, Judge Thornton looked at Caleb. Mr. Hart, you're representing yourself? I am, Your Honor. Then you may cross-examine the witness if you wish. Caleb stood, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. He wasn't a lawyer, didn't know the proper procedures or terminology, but he knew the truth, and he knew how to ask questions. Mr. Hale, he said quietly, when did you last see Elena before I found her? I'm not sure of the exact date. I was in Denver on business for several weeks. Several weeks. And you left Elena alone in that big house? She wasn't alone. I have staff who… What staff? I've been your neighbor for a week and I haven't seen a single person on your property except you. Vernon's expression tightened. My staff were given time off while I traveled. Elena had provisions and so she was alone for weeks while you were in Denver. Caleb let that sit for a moment. And during that time, did you worry about her well-being? Did you send anyone to check on her? I trusted her to manage herself. You trusted an allegedly mentally unstable 17-year-old girl to manage herself alone for weeks? Garrison stood. Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Hart is badgering the witness. Overruled, Judge Thornton said, looking interested for the first time. I'd like to hear Mr. Hale's answer. Vernon's jaw tightened. I believe she needed space and independence to work through her grief. Or you didn't care what happened to her as long as she was out of your way, Caleb said. Tell me, Mr. Hale, if Elena was in such a fragile mental state, why would you leave her completely alone? I've explained my reasoning. Have you? Because it seems to me that a concerned guardian doesn't abandon a grieving girl for weeks at a time, unless that guardian has another reason for wanting her isolated and dependent. Your Honor, Garrison interjected, this is speculation and character assassination. It's cross-examination, Caleb shot back, and I'm just getting started. Judge Thornton leaned back in his chair, studying both men. I'll allow it. Continue, Mr. Hart. Caleb looked directly at Vernon. You mentioned Edgar Thorne earlier. How do you know Mr. Thorne? Vernon's expression went carefully blank. He's a business associate. And did you ever discuss with Mr. Thorne the possibility of him marrying Elena? Certainly not. That's another of her fabrications. So if we brought Mr. Thorne here to testify, he would deny any such conversation ever took place? For the first time, Vernon hesitated. It was just a split second, but it was there, a flicker of uncertainty that suggested maybe Caleb had guessed right. Maybe Thorne wouldn't lie under oath to protect Vernon's reputation. I can't speak to what Mr. Thorne might say, Vernon said carefully, but I can tell you I never offered my ward in marriage to anyone. Your Honor, Caleb said, turning to the judge, I'd like to request that the court subpoena Edgar Thorne to testify about his conversations with Mr. Hale regarding Elena. Garrison was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, this is a fishing expedition. Mr. Thorne has nothing to do with the question of whether this marriage is valid. Actually, Judge Thornton said slowly, I think it might. If Mr. Hale was attempting to arrange a marriage for his ward without her consent, that goes directly to why she might have chosen to marry someone else. Request granted. Sheriff Coleman, send word to Mr. Thorne that his testimony is required. Vernon's carefully composed expression finally cracked, just slightly, and Caleb saw the fury burning underneath. This wasn't going the way Vernon had planned, and powerful men didn't like losing control of the narrative. But the damage was done. Caleb had planted doubt in the judge's mind, had opened a line of inquiry that Vernon clearly didn't want pursued. The hearing continued, but the momentum had shifted. When Elena took the stand and told her story, calmly, clearly, without hysteria or exaggeration, the observers listened differently. When Reverend Matthews testified that Elena had seemed perfectly rational and willing during the marriage ceremony, it carried weight. By the time Judge Thornton called for a recess, the outcome was no longer certain. Caleb and Elena stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by a few supporters who'd been swayed by her testimony. But Vernon stood across the street with his lawyers, his expression cold and calculating, and Caleb knew this was far from over. He's not done, Elena said quietly, following Caleb's gaze. This was just round one. I know. He'll come at us harder now. Use every resource he has. Let him. We just proved he's not invincible. Elena looked up at him, her eyes fierce despite the exhaustion pulling at her features. We can't just defend anymore. We need to attack, find evidence, witnesses, anything that proves Vernon is the monster he is. Agreed, but where do we start? Edgar Thorne, Elena said immediately. If we can get to him before Vernon does, convince him to tell the truth. You think he would? I don't know, but he's our best chance at proof Vernon was trying to force me into marriage. And if we can prove that, everything else Vernon's claiming falls apart. They were interrupted by a woman's voice, sharp and urgent. Mrs. Hart? They turned to find a slight woman in her 30s, plainly dressed, with nervous eyes and a carpet bag clutched in her hands. She glanced around like she was afraid of being seen, then stepped closer. "I need to speak with you," she said quietly. "About Vernon Hale. About what he's really like." Caleb and Elena exchanged glances. "Who are you?" Caleb asked. "My name is Margaret Winters. I used to work for Mr. Hale as a housekeeper." She swallowed hard. "I know what he did to you, Miss Elena, and I know you're not the first." The words hung in the cold afternoon air like smoke from a gun. Elena's face went pale, then flushed with something between hope and fury. Caleb felt his pulse quicken as he scanned the street. Vernon was still visible across the way, talking with his lawyers, but he hadn't noticed them yet. "We can't talk here," Caleb said quickly. "Come with us." Margaret nodded, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. They moved swiftly down the street toward where Caleb had tied his horse, trying to look casual while every instinct screamed that they needed to get this woman somewhere safe before Vernon realized what was happening. They were halfway to the livery when a voice called out behind them. "Mrs. Winters!" Margaret froze, her entire body going rigid. Caleb turned to see one of Vernon's lawyers. Not Garrison, but the younger one who'd been taking notes during the hearing, hurrying toward them with an expression that managed to be both friendly and threatening at once. "Mrs. Winters, what a surprise to see you in town," the lawyer said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Mr. Hale was just mentioning you this morning. He's been trying to reach you about a letter of recommendation for your new position." It was a warning dressed as pleasantry, and everyone understood it perfectly. Vernon knew Margaret had worked for him. Vernon knew she might talk, and Vernon was reminding her that he had power over her future employment, her reputation, her ability to survive in a world where women had few options for making a living. "I've been busy," Margaret said, her voice barely steady, "settling into my new situation." Of course, but Mr. Hale does hope you'll stop by before you leave town, just to catch up, as a courtesy." The lawyer's eyes flicked to Caleb and Elena, assessing the threat they represented. "I'm sure you wouldn't want any misunderstandings about your time in his employ." The implication was crystal clear. Talk, and Vernon would destroy whatever prospects she had, cooperate, and perhaps she'd be rewarded for her silence. "I'll consider it," Margaret said carefully. The lawyer nodded, satisfied that his message had been delivered, and walked back toward Vernon's group. As soon as he was out of earshot, Margaret's composure crumbled. Her hand shook as she clutched her carpetbag. "I can't do this," she whispered. "I have 3 children to feed. If Vernon blacklists me, no one in this county will hire me. I'll lose everything." "He's already threatening you," Elena said quietly, "which means what you know is dangerous to him. Important enough that he's scared of it coming out." "That doesn't pay my rent or feed my children." Caleb understood her fear, understood it in his bones because he'd seen what happened to people who went up against those with money and power. They got crushed, ground down to nothing, and the world kept turning like they'd never existed at all. But he also understood that silence was its own kind of death, that sometimes the only way to survive was to fight back even when the odds were impossible. "What if we could protect you?" he asked. "Make sure Vernon can't retaliate?" Margaret laughed, a bitter sound without humor. "How? You barely have protection for yourselves. I've heard the talk. He's cutting off your credit, turning the town against you, preparing to take everything you own. What makes you think you can protect me when you can't even protect yourselves?" "Because we're not fighting this alone anymore," Elena said with sudden conviction. "Vernon's power comes from people being too afraid to speak against him. But if enough people tell the truth, if enough witnesses come forward, he can't silence all of us. You're naive if you think that. Maybe. But I also know that Vernon kept me in a cellar for 2 months and almost got away with it because everyone was too scared to question him. How many other people has he hurt? How many other women has he destroyed while good people stayed silent because it was safer?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You don't understand what you're asking." "I do," Elena said softly. "I'm asking you to risk everything for the truth. I'm asking you to be braver than anyone should have to be. And I'm asking because you're the only one who can help stop him from doing this to someone else." They stood in the street, 3 people caught in the web of one man's cruelty, weighing safety against conscience. Caleb watched Margaret's face as she struggled with the decision, saw the fear and anger and desperate hope warring in her expression. Finally, she took a shaky breath. There's a boarding house on Maple Street, Mrs. Chen's place. I'm staying there tonight before heading back to my sister's ranch tomorrow. Come after dark. If I decide to talk, I'll let you in. If I don't, she trailed off, then squared her shoulders. If I don't, please respect my choice and don't ask again. We will, Caleb promised. Margaret hurried away, glancing back once before disappearing around a corner. Elena sagged against Caleb, exhaustion and hope and terror all mixing together. Do you think she'll talk? She asked. I don't know, but we gave her the choice, and that's more than Vernon ever did. They rode back to the ranch in silence, both processing what had happened at the hearing and what might happen if Margaret decided to come forward. The sun was setting by the time they arrived, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson that would have been beautiful if Caleb's mind hadn't been consumed with strategy and worry. Elena slid down from the horse and stood for a moment, staring at Vernon's dark house in the distance. He knows we talked to Margaret. He'll try to get to her first, convince her that cooperating with him is safer than helping us. Probably. So we need to get to her first, tonight, as soon as it's dark enough. Caleb nodded, already planning the route into town that would keep them least visible. But as he unsaddled the horse and led it to the barn, another thought occurred to him. Elena, what Margaret said about you not being the first, do you know what she meant? Elena's expression went grim. There were rumors, before my mother married Vernon, stories about a young maid who worked in his house and disappeared suddenly. People said she'd run off with a traveling merchant, but some thought... She swallowed hard. Some thought Vernon had gotten too familiar with her and paid her to leave quietly when she became inconvenient. Did anyone investigate? Who would investigate? She was a servant with no family in town. Vernon was a respected businessman. The law doesn't care much about girls like that. The law doesn't care. Those words echoed in Caleb's mind as he finished tending to the horse and followed Elena back to the house. The law was supposed to protect everyone, but in practice it protected property and power, and people like Elena and Margaret and that nameless maid were just obstacles to be removed or controlled. They ate a cold dinner of bread and cheese, neither of them with much appetite. As darkness fell, Caleb loaded his rifle and checked his revolver, preparing for the possibility that Vernon might try something tonight. Elena watched him with steady eyes, no longer the terrified girl he'd found in the cellar, but a woman who'd discovered her own capacity for courage. Whatever happens, she said quietly, thank you for believing me, for not dismissing my story as hysteria or delusion the way everyone else has. I heard you screaming in the dark, Caleb said, repeating what had become their touchstone. Everything else followed from that. Still, you could have walked away. Most people would have. I'm not most people. No, Elena agreed, a slight smile touching her lips. You're really not. They left for town an hour after full dark, moving quietly through the night. The temperature had dropped sharply, their breath fogging in the moonlight. Caleb kept to the edges of the road, listening for other riders, watching for signs of ambush. Vernon was desperate enough now that violence wasn't out of the question. Cedar Ridge was mostly dark when they arrived, just a few lit windows and the glow from the saloon's doors. They left the horse at the edge of town and walked to Maple Street on foot, staying in the shadows. Mrs. Chen's boarding house was a modest two-story structure with a neat garden and curtains drawn tight against the cold. Caleb knocked softly, and after a moment the door opened a crack. An elderly Chinese woman peered out, her expression wary. We're looking for Margaret Winters, Caleb said quietly. Mrs. Chen studied them for a long moment, then opened the door wider. She's expecting you. Upstairs, second door on the left. Be quick and be quiet. I run a respectable house, and I don't want trouble. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. They climbed the narrow stairs and found the door marked by a sliver of lamplight underneath. Caleb knocked gently. The door opened immediately, and Margaret pulled them inside with surprising strength. The room was small and spare. A bed, a chair, a washstand. Margaret's carpetbag sat packed and ready by the door, suggesting she was prepared to run if necessary. Her children weren't with her, Caleb realized. She'd sent them away, somewhere safe, before making this choice. I've been thinking about what you said, Margaret began without preamble. About silence being its own kind of death. About how many other people Vernon might hurt if no one stops him. She twisted her hands together, working up courage. I have daughters, 2 girls. And I keep thinking about them growing up in a world where men like Vernon Hale can do whatever they want to women and girls with no consequences. I keep thinking about what I'd want someone to do if it were my daughters in that cellar. You'll testify? Elena asked, hope rising in her voice. I'll tell you what I know. Whether I can testify in court. Margaret shook her head. I need to understand what that would mean for my family first, but you deserve to know the truth. She gestured for them to sit, then took a shaky breath and began. I worked for Vernon Hale for 2 years, starting about 6 months before he married your mother, she said, looking at Elena. At first he seemed like a good employer, demanding but fair, paid on time, didn't make inappropriate advances the way some men do. But after your mother came into the picture, things changed. How? Caleb asked. He became obsessed with appearances. Everything had to be perfect. The house, the grounds, the social events. Your mother was beautiful and refined, Miss Elena, and Vernon wanted to display her like a prize he'd won. But she was also kind, genuinely kind, and I don't think Vernon knew what to do with that. He was used to people he could control or buy, and your mother had her own mind. Elena's eyes glistened with tears. She tried to leave him once, about 3 months before she died. I remember hearing them argue late at night. She said she'd made a mistake, that the marriage wasn't what she'd hoped. Margaret nodded slowly. I remember that argument. Vernon made it very clear that she wouldn't leave, that he'd married her in good faith and she would honor her commitments whether she liked it or not. He said things. She paused, choosing words carefully. He made threats about what would happen to her reputation, to you, if she tried to divorce him. He had connections, he said, friends in Denver and beyond who could make sure she was ruined socially, that no decent family would associate with her or her daughter. He threatened my mother to keep her trapped in the marriage, Elena said flatly. Yes, and she stayed because she was trying to protect you. She told me once that she could endure anything as long as you were safe and provided for. The room fell silent except for the ticking of a clock somewhere downstairs. Caleb felt rage building in his chest. Not the hot, explosive kind, but cold and calculating. Vernon Hale was exactly the kind of predator he despised most, the kind who used law and social convention as weapons, who hurt people in ways that left no visible scars. After your mother died, Margaret continued, Vernon's true nature came out fully. He didn't need to pretend anymore. He started making comments about you, Miss Elena, about how you were becoming a woman, about your value in the marriage market. It made my skin crawl. Did he ever? Elena couldn't finish the question. No. He never touched you inappropriately that I saw. But the way he looked at you sometimes, the way he talked about your future, it was like you were livestock he was raising to sell at market. And when Edgar Thorne started visiting regularly, I knew exactly what was happening. Tell us about Thorne, Caleb said. Margaret's expression hardened. Edgar Thorne is a mining investor from Denver. Rich, widowed, no children. He and Vernon had business dealings, something about mineral rights and railroad expansion. Thorne visited the house 3 or 4 times over the course of a month, and each time Vernon made sure Elena was present at dinner, dressed in her best clothes, performing like a trained doll. I remember, Elena said quietly. Vernon told me I needed to make a good impression on his business associate, that it was important for the family's future prospects. He was auditioning you, Margaret said bluntly, showing Thorne what he'd be getting if he agreed to the match. I heard them talking once, late at night in Vernon's study. Vernon said you were 17 but mature for your age, well-educated, healthy stock. Those were his exact words, healthy stock, like you were a horse. Elena's hands clenched into fists. What did Thorne say? He was interested but cautious. Said he'd need assurances that you were docile, that's the word he used. He'd had a difficult time with his first wife, apparently, and didn't want another woman who'd challenge his authority. Vernon assured him you were biddable, that you understood a woman's place. And when I refused? Elena asked. When I told Vernon I'd rather die than marry Thorne? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. That's when everything went wrong. Vernon flew into a rage, not in front of the other staff, but I heard it through the walls. He was screaming about ungrateful children, about disobedience and disrespect. The next morning you were gone, and Vernon told everyone you'd run away, that you were having a mental breakdown from grief. But you knew better. I suspected. Vernon had the cellar secured with new chains and locks, which seemed odd for wine storage. And I noticed he'd go down there sometimes with food and water, more than one person would need. But I was too afraid to ask questions, too afraid to look too closely at what was happening. The shame in her voice was palpable. Caleb understood it, the guilt of knowing something was wrong but being too scared or powerless to intervene. It was the same guilt that had haunted him most of his life. You couldn't have stopped him, Elena said gently. He would have just gotten rid of you and found someone else who'd stay quiet. Maybe, but I still should have tried. Instead, I quit a week after you disappeared, told Vernon I was leaving to care for my sick sister, which was partly true. But really, I just couldn't stay in that house anymore, knowing what I suspected. Did Vernon let you go easily? He paid me what he owed, gave me a decent letter of recommendation, and made it clear that my continued employment prospects in the county depended on my discretion about family matters. I understood the message. Caleb leaned forward. Margaret, if you testified to all this in court, about the threats to Elena's mother, about the arrangement with Thorne, about Vernon's character, it would destroy his credibility. It would prove Elena's telling the truth about everything. It would also destroy me, Margaret said quietly. Vernon would make sure I never worked again. He'd spread rumors that I was a thief or a drunk or worse. My children would suffer for my choice. Not if we win, Elena said. If we can prove Vernon's a monster publicly enough that the law has to act, his power evaporates. He won't be able to threaten anyone anymore. That's a big if. It is, Caleb admitted, but it's also the only way this ends. Vernon won't stop until someone stops him. He'll keep hurting people, keep using his money and influence to escape consequences, unless enough people stand up and say no more. Margaret looked between them, these two young people who'd already risked so much for a principle that should have been simple but never was, that the powerful shouldn't be allowed to prey on the vulnerable without consequence. I need time to think, she said finally, to talk to my sister, to make sure my children will be provided for if Vernon retaliates. Give me 2 days. We don't have 2 days, Elena said urgently. The hearing resumes tomorrow afternoon. Judge Thornton will make his ruling on whether our marriage is valid, and if he sides with Vernon, then you're back in his custody, and all this was for nothing. I know. Margaret stood pacing the small room. But I have to think about my children first. I have to make sure they'll be safe. Caleb understood, even as frustration built in his chest. Margaret had her own family to protect, her own survival to consider. Asking her to risk everything on their behalf wasn't fair, even if it was necessary. Is there anything we can offer? He asked. Money, protection, anything that would make this easier for you? I don't want money. And protection, Margaret shook her head. How can you protect me when you can barely protect yourselves? It was a fair question with no good answer. They left the boarding house 20 minutes later with nothing resolved. Margaret's promise to think about it feeling more like a polite refusal than genuine consideration. She won't testify, Elena said as they walked back through the dark streets. She's too scared, and I can't blame her. Vernon has destroyed enough lives. Why should she sacrifice her children's future for us? Because it's right. Right doesn't feed hungry mouths or keep a roof over your head. Caleb wanted to argue, to insist that doing the right thing mattered more than safety or comfort. But he'd been hungry before, had known what it was like to choose between principles and survival. And survival usually won, because dead heroes didn't help anyone. They were passing the alley between the general store and the feed supply when a voice spoke from the shadows. Mrs. Hart. Mr. Hart. A word, if you please. Caleb's hand went to his revolver, but the figure that stepped into the moonlight had his hands raised in a gesture of peace. It was Edgar Thorne, older than Vernon by 20 years, heavy-set and prosperous-looking, wearing expensive clothes and an expression of profound discomfort. Easy, Thorne said. I'm not here to cause trouble. Quite the opposite, actually. What do you want? Caleb asked, not removing his hand from the gun. To apologize. And to offer my help if you'll accept it. Elena stared at him with barely concealed disgust. You wanted to buy me like cattle. Why would we accept anything from you? Thorne flinched. You're right. What Vernon proposed, what I considered, it was reprehensible. I don't have a good excuse except that I'm a lonely old fool who let Vernon convince me that a business arrangement could substitute for a genuine relationship. Is that supposed to make it better? Elena demanded. No, it's supposed to explain why I'm here now trying to make amends. Thorne glanced around nervously. Vernon doesn't know I'm speaking with you. If he did, he'd consider it a betrayal of our business relationship. But I received a subpoena today requiring my testimony at your hearing tomorrow, and it's given me the opportunity to do what I should have done months ago, tell the truth. Caleb's pulse quickened. What truth? That Vernon Hale explicitly offered his stepdaughter to me in a marriage arrangement that was contingent on my investing in his latest mining venture. That he described her as young, obedient, and available for the right price. That when I expressed doubts about the arrangement's propriety, Vernon assured me that Elena was his property to dispose of as he saw fit. You'll testify to this in court? Elena asked, her voice sharp with disbelief. I will. Not because I'm suddenly virtuous, I'm not, but because I've been married 3 times, Mrs. Hart, and I know the difference between a woman who wants to be a wife and one who's being forced into it. When I saw you at dinner with Vernon, I saw fear, and I was willing to overlook that fear for my own comfort, which makes me complicit in his cruelty. Why the change of heart? Caleb asked skeptically. Thorne's expression turned bitter. Because Vernon tried to have me killed. The words dropped like stones into still water. Elena took a step back, her eyes wide. Caleb's hand tightened on his revolver. What are you talking about? Caleb demanded. 3 days ago, I was riding back to my hotel after dinner when 2 men jumped me in an alley. They beat me badly enough that I spent a day in bed recovering. Before they left, one of them said, Mr. Hale sends his regards and suggests you reconsider your business relationship. I understood the message. Vernon knew I'd been subpoenaed, and he was making sure I understood what would happen if I testified honestly. But you're here anyway. I'm here because I'm tired of being afraid of men like Vernon Hale. I'm here because beating an old man in an alley was a mistake on Vernon's part. It showed me exactly what he's capable of, which means every terrible thing you've said about him is probably true. Thorne straightened his shoulders. I'll testify tomorrow. I'll tell Judge Thornton everything about the arrangement Vernon proposed. And if it costs me my business relationship with him, so be it. I have enough money to retire comfortably. What I don't have is enough integrity to keep silent after what I've learned. Elena looked at Caleb, hope and suspicion warring in her expression. This was exactly what they needed, a credible witness who could corroborate her story about Vernon's attempt to force her into marriage. But it seemed too convenient, too easy. How do we know this isn't a trap? Caleb asked. How do we know Vernon didn't send you to give us false hope, only to have you recant on the stand? You don't, Thorne admitted. You'll have to trust me, which I realize I haven't earned, but I'm asking you to anyway. Because tomorrow morning I'm going to walk into that courthouse and destroy whatever reputation I have left by admitting I was willing to buy a teenage bride. And the only reason I'm willing to do that is because it might help stop Vernon from hurting anyone else. They stood in the cold alley, 3 unlikely allies bound together by one man's cruelty. Caleb studied Thorne's face, looking for signs of deception, but all he saw was exhausted sincerity. All right, he said finally. We'll see you in court tomorrow. Thorne nodded and disappeared back into the shadows, moving quickly like a man who knew he was being watched. Caleb and Elena stood silent for a moment, processing what had just happened. Do you believe him? Elena asked quietly. I don't know. But if he's telling the truth, it changes everything. And if he's not? Then we're exactly where we were before, fighting a battle we can't win with weapons we don't have. They retrieved their horse and rode home through darkness that felt heavier than before, weighed down by tomorrow's uncertainty. The ranch looked small and vulnerable in the moonlight, and Vernon's house loomed in the distance like a threat made physical. Inside, Caleb built up the fire while Elena sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she wasn't drinking. The silence between them was comfortable now, the silence of people who'd been through enough together that words weren't always necessary. Whatever happens tomorrow, Elena said finally, I want you to know that you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. What's that? Hope. The belief that the world might be more than just cruel and that sometimes people help each other for no reason except that it's right. She looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much darkness, but were choosing to believe in light anyway. Even if Vernon wins tomorrow, even if I end up back in his custody, you gave me that, and I'll carry it with me no matter what. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. Vernon's not going to win. We'll fight him with everything we have. I know, but if fighting isn't enough, it will be. It has to be. But even as he said it, Caleb wondered if he was trying to convince Elena or himself. They'd gambled everything on the hope that truth mattered more than money, that the law would side with justice over power. And tomorrow they'd find out if that hope was justified or just another beautiful lie people told themselves to make the world seem less brutal than it was. They sat by the fire until late, neither wanting to face the dreams that waited in darkness. When Elena finally went to bed, Caleb settled in his bedroll with the rifle close at hand, listening to the wind howl around the house and thinking about all the ways tomorrow could destroy them. Morning came gray and cold, with frost covering everything in white silence. They prepared for the hearing like soldiers preparing for battle, methodically, grimly, with the understanding that what happened in the next few hours would determine the course of their entire lives. The ride into town felt longer than usual, every minute stretching thin with anxiety. Other riders passed them on the road, some nodding politely, others staring with open hostility. News had spread about the hearing, about the accusations flying back and forth, and the town had chosen sides based on loyalty and self-interest rather than truth. The courthouse was already crowded when they arrived. More people than yesterday, drawn by the promise of scandal and the kind of public drama that broke up the monotony of frontier life. Vernon stood with his lawyers on the steps, his expression calm and confident. When he saw them, he smiled, a cold, proprietary smile that made Elena shrink against Caleb's side. "Courage," Caleb murmured. "We're not alone in this anymore." But looking at the crowd, at the hostile faces and curious stares, he wondered if that was true. Edgar Thorne was nowhere to be seen. Margaret Winters hadn't contacted them. They were walking into that courthouse with nothing but each other, and the desperate hope that the truth would somehow be enough. Judge Thornton called the hearing to order precisely at 9 o'clock. The gallery was packed, people standing along the walls when the seats filled up. The air was thick with anticipation and judgment. "We're here to continue proceedings regarding the petition to annul the marriage between Caleb Hart and Elena Hart, formerly Elena Mercer," Thornton announced. "Yesterday we heard from Mr. Vernon Hale and several character witnesses. Today we'll hear from the defense and any additional witnesses. Mr. Hart, you may proceed." Caleb stood, his mouth dry, acutely aware of how much was riding on what happened next. "Your Honor, I'd like to call Edgar Thorne to testify." A murmur ran through the crowd. Vernon's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, surprise, maybe, or concern. "Is Mr. Thorne present?" Judge Thornton asked. Silence. Caleb's heart sank as seconds ticked past with no response. Had Thorne changed his mind? Had Vernon gotten to him? Had last night's conversation been nothing but false hope designed to— "I'm here, Your Honor." The voice came from the back of the courtroom. The crowd parted as Edgar Thorne walked forward, his face bruised from the beating he'd described, his expression set with determination. He moved slowly, favoring his left side, each step a visible effort. Vernon's calm facade cracked. His face went red, then pale, and his lawyers immediately huddled around him, whispering urgently. Thorne took the stand and was sworn in. Caleb approached, suddenly aware that he had no legal training, no experience with examination and cross-examination. But he had something more important. He had the right questions. "Mr. Thorne, how do you know Vernon Hale?" "We're business associates, or we were. I'm not sure what we are now." "Can you describe the nature of your business relationship?" "Vernon and I have invested jointly in several mining operations over the past 5 years. He has local connections and knowledge of mineral rights. I have capital. It's been mutually profitable." "And did your business relationship ever extend to personal matters?" Thorne's jaw tightened. "Yes. This past summer, Vernon proposed an arrangement involving his stepdaughter, Elena Mercer." The courtroom erupted. Judge Thornton's gavel cracked like a gunshot, demanding order. When the noise subsided, he leaned forward. "Mr. Thorne, please explain this arrangement in detail." Thorne took a breath, and Caleb could see the cost of what he was about to do written in every line of his face. "Vernon told me his stepdaughter was of marriageable age, and that he was looking for a suitable husband for her. He described her as attractive, healthy, well-educated, and most importantly, obedient. He said if I was interested in marriage, he could arrange it, provided I agreed to invest substantially in his latest mining venture." "He was selling her," Elena said from her seat, her voice cutting through the shocked silence. "Like property?" "Essentially, yes," Thorne admitted, though he framed it as ensuring she was provided for and securing a beneficial alliance for both families. "And you agreed to this?" Judge Thornton's voice was sharp with disapproval. "I considered it. To my eternal shame, I considered it seriously. I'm a widower, lonely, and Vernon made it sound reasonable, a business arrangement that would benefit everyone involved." "Did you ever meet Miss Mercer as part of this arrangement?" Caleb asked. "Yes. Vernon invited me to dinner on 3 separate occasions. Elena was required to attend, to display herself for my inspection. She was polite but clearly uncomfortable. I told myself she was just shy, but I knew better. I knew she didn't want to be there." Vernon shot to his feet. "This is outrageous. These are complete fabrications designed to—" "Sit down, Mr. Hale," Judge Thornton said coldly. "You'll have your chance to respond. Continue, Mr. Thorne." "The third time I visited, I told Vernon I was interested in pursuing the arrangement. We discussed terms, a bride price, essentially, disguised as an investment in his mining operation. $50,000 in exchange for his stepdaughter's hand in marriage and his assurance that she would be a dutiful wife." The number hung in the air. $50,000. Vernon had valued Elena's freedom, her future, her entire life at $50,000. "What happened next?" Caleb asked, keeping his voice steady through rising fury. "I went back to Denver to think about it. And the more I thought, the more uncomfortable I became. This was a human being we were discussing, not livestock. I decided to decline Vernon's offer and suggested he find someone closer to Elena's age and circumstances." "How did Mr. Hale respond?" "He was furious. Accused me of wasting his time and backing out of a gentleman's agreement. That's when I learned what had happened to Elena, that she'd refused to cooperate with the arrangement and that Vernon had taken steps to ensure her compliance." "What steps?" Thorne looked at Vernon, and there was no pity in his eyes. "He told me he'd secured her in his cellar until she came to her senses. He said young women sometimes needed firm discipline to understand their duty, and that a few weeks without comfort would make her more amenable to marriage." The courtroom exploded again. People were shouting, some in outrage, some in disbelief. Judge Thornton's gavel cracked repeatedly, barely maintaining control. Vernon was on his feet, his face purple with rage. "Lies! All lies! This man is fabricating testimony because you had me beaten in an alley 3 days ago," Thorne shouted back. "Because you sent thugs to threaten me into silence when you learned I'd been subpoenaed." The courtroom went dead silent. Even Judge Thornton looked stunned. "You're accusing Mr. Hale of assault?" the judge asked carefully. "I'm accusing him of attempted intimidation. 2 men attacked me, beat me severely, and delivered a message explicitly from Vernon Hale warning me to reconsider my business relationship. I have medical records documenting my injuries. I have the names of witnesses who saw me immediately afterward, and I have no reason to fabricate any of this except that it's the truth." Vernon's lawyers were frantically whispering, but Vernon himself seemed to have lost the capacity for calculated response. His mask of respectability had shattered, revealing the rage and arrogance underneath. "You're a liar and a fool," he snarled at Thorne. "You'll regret this." "Is that a threat, Mr. Hale?" Judge Thornton's voice was ice cold. Vernon seemed to realize he'd made a fatal mistake. He sat down abruptly, his lawyers pulling him into a huddle while the courtroom buzzed with shock and speculation. Judge Thornton looked at Caleb. "Do you have any other witnesses?" Before Caleb could respond, a voice spoke from the back of the room. "I have testimony to offer, Your Honor." Margaret Winters stood in the doorway, her hands shaking but her voice steady. "I used to work for Vernon Hale, and I have information this court needs to hear." Elena's hand found Caleb's and gripped it tight, her eyes wide with disbelief and hope. Margaret walked down the center aisle with the deliberate steps of someone who'd made an impossible choice and was determined to see it through. Her plain dress was pressed and clean, her hair pulled back severely, her face pale but resolute. Vernon watched her approach with an expression that shifted from shock to calculation to barely suppressed fury. His lead lawyer, Garrison, stood quickly. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Mrs. Winters wasn't on any witness list, and we've had no opportunity to prepare. Neither was Mr. Thorne until yesterday," Judge Thornton interrupted. "And given what we've just heard, I'm inclined to allow any testimony that sheds light on Mr. Hale's character and the circumstances surrounding this marriage. Mrs. Winters, please approach the bench." Margaret walked to the witness stand, was sworn in, and sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked at Elena once, and something passed between them. An understanding between women who'd both survived Vernon Hale's particular brand of cruelty. "Mrs. Winters," Judge Thornton said gently, "please state your relationship to the parties involved." "I worked as a housekeeper in Vernon Hale's employ for 2 years, starting 6 months before he married Elena's mother and ending about 3 weeks after Elena disappeared. I left town shortly after to live with my sister, but I came back when I heard about this hearing." "Why did you feel compelled to return?" Margaret's voice shook slightly but held. "Because I knew what Vernon Hale was capable of, and I couldn't let him destroy another person through lies and legal manipulation, not when I had information that could prevent it." "Tell us what you know," the judge said. Margaret took a breath and began recounting what she'd told them the night before. The threats to Elena's mother, the arrangement with Edgar Thorne, Vernon's transformation after his wife's death. But sitting here in the formal courtroom, speaking it into the public record, her testimony carried different weight. This wasn't gossip or rumor. This was sworn evidence from a woman who'd been inside Vernon's house, who'd witnessed his private cruelty firsthand. The courtroom listened in absolute silence. Even the people who'd come expecting to support Vernon seemed shaken by the accumulating testimony. The picture Margaret painted was damning. A man who controlled through fear, who saw people as assets to be managed, who escalated to imprisonment when his stepdaughter refused to be sold. After Elena disappeared, Margaret continued, Vernon's behavior became even more erratic. He was obsessed with maintaining appearances, telling everyone she'd run away or was suffering mental distress. But I noticed he'd secured the old cellar with new chains and locks. I saw him go down there with food and water, more than one person would need for themselves. "Did you investigate?" Judge Thornton asked. "No, Your Honor. To my shame, I didn't. I was afraid of what I'd find, and more afraid of what would happen to me and my children if I crossed Vernon Hale. So I quit and left town, telling myself it wasn't my business." "What changed your mind?" Margaret looked directly at Elena. "I saw her testify yesterday. I saw a young woman fighting for her freedom against a man who'd tried to break her completely, and I realized that my silence made me complicit, that choosing safety over truth was its own kind of betrayal." Vernon could contain himself no longer. He stood, ignoring his lawyer's attempts to pull him back down. "This is a conspiracy," he shouted. "These people have coordinated their lies to defame me, to steal what's rightfully mine. Elena is my legal ward, and this man," he pointed at Caleb with shaking fury, "has kidnapped her, coerced her into an unlawful marriage, and now brought forward false witnesses to cover his crimes." "Sit down, Mr. Hale," Judge Thornton said, his voice like iron. I will not sit here while my reputation is destroyed by liars and—" "Sheriff Coleman," the judge said quietly, "please escort Mr. Hale out of my courtroom. He can return when he's ready to conduct himself with appropriate decorum." The sheriff moved forward, but Vernon's lawyers intervened quickly, speaking in urgent whispers until Vernon finally, grudgingly, sat down. His face was mottled red and white with rage, his hands clenched so tight the knuckles had gone bloodless. Judge Thornton turned back to Margaret. "Mrs. Winters, do you have any direct evidence of Miss Mercer being imprisoned in that cellar? Anything beyond your suspicions?" "No, Your Honor. I never went down there myself. But I can tell you that the cellar was never secured like that before Elena disappeared. And I can tell you that Vernon's behavior, the secrecy, the obsessive control, the lies about Elena's mental state, all pointed to something terrible happening in that house." "And the arrangement with Mr. Thorne? You witnessed that directly?" I overheard conversations between them. I saw Elena being paraded at dinners like livestock at auction, and I heard Vernon tell Mr. Thorne that Elena was his property to dispose of as he saw fit. Garrison stood for cross-examination, his expression carefully neutral. Mrs. Winters, you stated you left Mr. Hale's employment 3 weeks after Miss Mercer disappeared. Why exactly did you leave? I told Mr. Hale I needed to care for my sick sister. But that wasn't the real reason, was it? Margaret hesitated. Not entirely, no. So you lied to your employer, which raises the question. If you were willing to lie then, why should this court believe you're telling the truth now? I lied to protect myself and my children from a dangerous man. I'm telling the truth now for the same reason. How convenient. Garrison's tone was sharp. You claim Mr. Hale threatened Miss Mercer's mother, yet Mrs. Mercer Hale never filed any complaints with authorities. You claim you witnessed evidence of imprisonment, yet you took no action and reported nothing. You claim to have overheard private conversations about selling Miss Mercer, yet you have no documentation, no other witnesses, nothing but your word. My word is the truth. Or it's a story you've coordinated with the defendants to extract money from Mr. Hale. Did they pay you to testify today, Mrs. Winters? No. Offer you protection? Employment? Anything of value in exchange for your testimony? They offered me the chance to do the right thing, that's all. Garrison smiled thinly. How noble. Tell me, Mrs. Winters, how much does Mr. Hale owe you in back wages? Margaret's expression went carefully blank. Nothing. He paid me what was due when I left. Are you certain? Because I have records here showing a dispute over compensation, specifically that you claimed Mr. Hale owed you for 2 weeks of work he refused to pay. That's not... It was a misunderstanding, nothing more. A misunderstanding that was resolved only after you threatened to spread rumors about his household unless he paid. Correct? Margaret's face flushed. I never threatened anything. I asked for wages I'd earned, and he eventually paid them. After you leveraged his reputation to force payment, which suggests you're comfortable using threats and accusations to get what you want from Vernon Hale, doesn't it? Your Honor, Caleb interjected, Mr. Garrison is twisting... I'll decide what's being twisted, Mr. Hart, Judge Thornton said. But I'll note that Mr. Garrison seems to be working very hard to discredit a witness whose testimony corroborates other evidence we've heard. Continue, but make your point quickly. Garrison turned back to Margaret. You claim to care about truth and justice, yet you waited until now, until the most dramatic possible moment, to come forward. Why not go to the sheriff weeks ago when you first suspected Miss Mercer was being held against her will? Because I was afraid. Because Sheriff Coleman takes his orders from men like Vernon Hale, and I knew reporting my suspicions would accomplish nothing except making me a target. So you're accusing Sheriff Coleman of corruption now? I'm saying that power protects power, and women like me, like Elena, don't get justice unless we fight for it ourselves. The words rang through the courtroom, and Caleb saw heads nodding, especially among the women in the gallery. Margaret might be scared, might have waited too long, might have her own complicated motivations, but she was speaking a truth everyone recognized. Garrison seemed to sense he was losing ground. No further questions, Your Honor. Margaret stepped down, her hand still shaking but her expression defiant. As she passed Vernon's table, he leaned forward and spoke just loud enough for nearby people to hear. You'll regret this, Margaret. Your sister's ranch. That loan from the bank is coming due soon, isn't it? Be a shame if they decided not to extend it. Margaret froze. Judge Thornton's gavel cracked like thunder. Mr. Hale, that is the second time you've made threats in my courtroom. One more word out of turn and I'll hold you in contempt. Am I understood? Vernon settled back in his chair, but the damage was done. Everyone had heard him. Everyone had seen the casual cruelty, the reflexive use of financial power as a weapon. It was exactly the behavior Elena and Margaret and Thorne had described. The real Vernon Hale, stripped of his mask of respectability. Judge Thornton looked exhausted and disgusted. Mr. Hart, do you have any additional witnesses? Just one, Your Honor. I'd like to call Elena Hart to testify on her own behalf. Elena stood, and Caleb could feel her trembling even from a few feet away. But when she walked to the witness stand, her spine was straight and her eyes were clear. She'd survived Vernon's worst. A courtroom held no terrors compared to that cellar. The oath was administered. Elena sat, her hands folded in her lap, waiting. Caleb approached, and their eyes met. They'd prepared for this, had talked through what needed to be said. But standing here now, asking her to relive her trauma for the entertainment of a crowd that might not even believe her, it felt cruel. "Tell them," she said softly, before he could ask his first question. "I'm ready to tell them everything." So she did. She spoke about her mother's marriage to Vernon, about the subtle controls that had seemed like protectiveness at first. She described watching her mother wilt under Vernon's criticisms, seeing her light dim month by month until there was almost nothing left. She talked about her mother's attempts to leave and Vernon's threats, the way he'd used money and social connections as chains more effective than iron. "When my mother died," Elena said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks, "Vernon's true nature emerged. He no longer had to pretend to be kind or patient. He looked at me like I was property he'd inherited along with the furniture and silverware." She described the dinners with Edgar Thorne, the humiliation of being displayed and evaluated, the growing horror as she realized Vernon intended to sell her in marriage to fund his business ventures. She talked about refusing, about the argument that followed, about being dragged to the cellar and chained inside. "He told me I'd stay there until I understood my place," she said, her voice breaking. "Until I agreed to marry whoever he chose. He said young women needed to be broken like horses. That stubbornness could be starved out of them if you were patient enough." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the people who'd come prepared to disbelieve her seemed shaken by the raw honesty in her voice. "How long were you down there?" Caleb asked gently. "I lost count. Weeks, maybe 2 months. At first, Vernon came regularly with just enough food and water to keep me alive. Then his visits became less frequent. The last time I saw him before Caleb found me, he said he was going to Denver and would decide what to do with me when he returned. I thought—" She paused, gathering herself. "I thought he'd decided to let me die, that it was easier than continuing to deal with my disobedience." "What do you remember about being rescued?" "Darkness. Cold. The certainty that I was going to die alone in that hole. Then I heard gunfire and the chains falling away, and there was light, so much light it hurt. Caleb carried me out, and for the first time in months I could see stars." She looked at Caleb, and the gratitude in her eyes was almost painful to witness. He didn't know me, had no reason to help me, but he heard me crying in the dark, and he came. He risked everything to pull me out of that cellar, and then he kept risking everything to make sure I stayed free. "Why did you agree to marry him?" Caleb asked. "Because it was the only way Vernon couldn't drag me back. As long as I was his ward, he had legal control over me. Marriage was the only escape, and Caleb offered it freely, without conditions or expectations. He didn't save me to own me. He saved me to free me." Garrison stood for cross-examination, and Caleb returned to his seat, his stomach churning with anxiety about what was coming. "Mrs. Hart," Garrison began, his tone deceptively gentle, "you've told us a compelling story, but stories aren't evidence. Do you have any proof that you were imprisoned in that cellar?" "The cellar itself is proof. The chains, the lock Caleb shot open, which could have been placed there for any number of legitimate reasons. Mr. Hale has explained they were for security purposes." "He's lying." "Or you are. Tell me, Mrs. Hart, do you suffer from any mental health conditions?" Elena's expression hardened. "No." "Depression, anxiety following your mother's death?" "Grief isn't a mental illness. But it can cause irrational behavior, can it? Paranoia, false memories, seeing threats where none exist." "I'm not paranoid. Everything I've described happened exactly as I said." "So you claim. But we have Dr. Harrison's letter expressing concern about your mental state, noting symptoms consistent with hysteria and delusion." "I never met Dr. Harrison. Vernon paid him to write that letter." "Another accusation with no proof. You seem to have a pattern of making serious allegations you can't substantiate." "I have witnesses. Edgar Thorne confirmed Vernon tried to sell me. Margaret confirmed she saw—" Mr. Thorne is a jilted business partner with an axe to grind. Mrs. Winters is a disgruntled former employee who tried to extort money from Mr. Hale. Neither is exactly a credible witness. They're telling the truth, or they're telling you what you want to hear. Tell me, Mrs. Hart, how long did you know Mr. Caleb Hart before you married him? Elena hesitated. Less than a day. Less than a day. And in that brief period, you decided to marry a complete stranger? To escape Vernon, yes. Or because you were mentally unstable and vulnerable to manipulation. Isn't it possible that Mr. Hart saw an opportunity, a wealthy man's ward potentially entitled to inheritance, and convinced you to marry him while you were in a fragile state? That's not what happened. How do you know? You were starving, dehydrated, traumatized. You'd just been found by a stranger in the middle of the night. Isn't it possible you weren't thinking clearly? That you latched onto the first person who showed you kindness without truly understanding what you were agreeing to? I knew exactly what I was doing. I was choosing freedom. Or you were being coerced by a different man, one who saw vulnerability and exploited it for his own gain. Caleb wanted to object, to defend himself, but he had no legal standing to interrupt. He could only watch as Garrison systematically tried to reframe the narrative, making Elena the unstable victim of one man's manipulation rather than another's, making Caleb the villain instead of Vernon. But Elena didn't break. She met every accusation with calm denial, every implication with clear rebuttal. And slowly, Caleb saw the crowd shifting. They'd heard Vernon's threats in open court. They'd heard Thorne's testimony about being beaten. They'd heard Margaret describe Vernon's cruelty. And now they were watching a young woman defend her choices with dignity and intelligence, showing no signs of the hysteria or delusion Garrison kept implying. Finally, Garrison seemed to realize he was doing more harm than good. No further questions, Your Honor. Elena stepped down and Caleb reached for her hand as she passed. She gripped it tight, drawing strength from the contact. Judge Thornton surveyed the courtroom with an expression of deep weariness. I've heard enough testimony for today. We'll recess until tomorrow morning, at which time I'll deliver my ruling on the petition to annul this marriage. Court is adjourned. The gavel fell, and the courtroom erupted into conversation. Caleb and Elena stood quickly, wanting to leave before Vernon could approach. But as they headed for the door, Sheriff Coleman blocked their path. A word, Mr. Hart. Caleb's hand moved instinctively toward his revolver, but Coleman raised his hands in a gesture of peace. Easy. I'm not here to arrest anyone. I'm here to tell you that Mr. Hale has filed assault charges against you for breaking into his property and destroying his lock. That's insane. I was rescuing his prisoner. According to you. According to him, you were trespassing and destroying property. Now, I don't particularly care what Vernon Hale thinks right now, given what I've heard in that courtroom, but legally, he has the right to file charges, and I have to at least pretend to investigate. What does that mean? Coleman sighed. It means don't leave the county. It means I'll be asking you some questions over the next few days. And it means Vernon is throwing everything he can at you, hoping something sticks. Sheriff, Elena said quietly, do you believe what we've said about Vernon? About what he did to me? Coleman looked at her for a long moment. Ma'am, in 20 years of law enforcement, I've learned that the truth is usually uglier than anyone wants to admit, especially when money and power are involved. Do I believe Vernon Hale is capable of what you've described? Yeah, I do. Can I prove it in a way that would stand up to his lawyers and his political connections? That's the question that keeps me up at night. So he'll get away with it. I didn't say that. I said it's complicated. But for what it's worth, I hope Judge Thornton rules in your favor tomorrow. You deserve to be free of that man. He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving them standing in the courthouse hall with the weight of tomorrow's uncertainty pressing down like a physical thing. They rode home in silence, both too exhausted for conversation. The ranch looked the same as always, small and weathered and vulnerable, but it felt different now. It felt like sanctuary, like the one place in the world where they could breathe without fear. That night, Elena insisted on cooking dinner despite her obvious exhaustion. She moved around the small kitchen with increasing confidence. No longer the hollow ghost Caleb had pulled from the cellar, but a woman reclaiming her life piece by piece. Do you think we won? She asked as they ate. I don't know. Judge Thornton seems sympathetic, but Vernon's lawyers will argue that sympathy isn't evidence. Thorne's testimony was evidence. Margaret's testimony was evidence. Circumstantial evidence, they'll say. Not enough to override a guardian's legal rights. Elena set down her fork. If Thornton rules against us tomorrow, if he annuls our marriage and sends me back to Vernon, what will you do? I won't let that happen. But if it does? Caleb met her eyes across the table. Then we run. We take the horses and whatever we can carry, and we disappear into the territories where Vernon's influence can't reach. We start over somewhere new. You'd do that? Give up everything you've worked for? Everything I've worked for is just land and wood. It's not worth your freedom. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled through them. You know, when you first found me, I didn't believe people like you existed. I thought everyone was either cruel like Vernon or too scared to stand up to cruelty. But you're neither. You're just good. Genuinely good. I'm not. You are. And whether we win or lose tomorrow, whether we stay here or run, I'm grateful I found you, that you found me. They finished dinner in comfortable silence, and Caleb found himself thinking about what life might look like if they did have to run, where they'd go, how they'd survive, whether Elena could truly be happy starting over again in some distant place where no one knew her name or story. It would be hard, dangerous even. But looking at her across the table, seeing the strength that had grown in her over these past weeks, he thought maybe they could do it. Maybe together they could build something good out of all this ugliness. That night, Caleb dreamed of the cellar, of finding it empty, the chains broken, Elena vanished into darkness he couldn't penetrate. He woke in a cold sweat, reaching for his rifle before remembering where he was. The house was quiet except for Elena's breathing from the bedroom, steady and peaceful. She was safe. For now, she was safe. Morning came too quickly, gray light filtering through windows that needed better curtains. They dressed in their best clothes, Caleb in the suit he'd worn to their wedding, Elena in his mother's dress that she'd carefully mended and pressed. They looked like a respectable frontier couple, which was exactly what they needed to be. The ride to town felt eternal and too short all at once. Other riders joined them on the road, people heading to the courthouse for the ruling, drawn by gossip and the desire to see how this drama concluded. Some nodded politely, others stared with open hostility or pity. The courtroom was packed again, every seat filled and people standing along the walls. Vernon sat with his lawyers, his expression carefully controlled but his eyes burning with barely suppressed fury. He'd lost the crowd's sympathy, lost his reputation as a respectable businessman, but he still had the law on his side. Or at least, he thought he did. Judge Thornton entered precisely at 9 o'clock, and the room fell silent. He carried a stack of papers and wore an expression that gave nothing away. This has been one of the more disturbing cases I've presided over in my 20 years on the bench. He began without preamble. I've heard testimony alleging imprisonment, forced marriage arrangements, assault, and intimidation. I've watched a man I previously considered respectable make threats in open court, and I've had to weigh competing claims about truth and credibility when both sides present compelling arguments. Caleb felt Elena's hand find his, gripping tight enough to hurt. The question before me, Thornton continued, is whether the marriage between Caleb Hart and Elena Mercer, now Hart, is valid, or whether it should be annulled on grounds that Miss Mercer was mentally incompetent to consent and that Mr. Hart exercised undue influence. He paused, looking directly at Vernon. Mr. Hale has presented evidence of his ward's supposed mental fragility, a letter from a doctor she never met, testimony from witnesses describing withdrawn behavior that could equally be attributed to grief or fear, and the assertion that no rational person would marry a stranger after less than a day's acquaintance. Vernon's expression began to shift toward triumph. However, Thornton continued, and the word fell like a hammer, Mr. Hale has failed to explain several troubling facts. He failed to explain why he secured a cellar with heavy chains and new locks, if not to imprison someone. He failed to explain credible testimony from Edgar Thorne about an arrangement to sell his ward in marriage. He failed to explain why a concerned guardian would leave an allegedly mentally ill ward alone for weeks without supervision or care. And most damningly, he failed to conduct himself with the dignity and restraint one would expect from a man genuinely concerned for his ward's well-being. Vernon's face went pale. Instead, Thornton said, his voice hard as iron. I watched Vernon Hale make threats against witnesses in my courtroom. I heard him attempt to intimidate Mrs. Winters regarding her sister's bank loan. I saw him display the kind of controlling fury that lends credibility to every allegation made against him. The judge shuffled his papers. I've also considered the testimony of Elena Hart herself. I observed a young woman who spoke clearly and consistently about her experiences, who showed no signs of mental incompetence or hysteria, and who articulated rational reasons for her choices. The fact that she chose to marry quickly doesn't indicate mental illness. It indicates desperation to escape a dangerous situation. Caleb could barely breathe. Elena's hand was shaking in his. Therefore, Judge Thornton announced, I find that Elena Hart was mentally competent at the time of her marriage, that she entered into said marriage of her own free will without undue influence or coercion from Caleb Hart, and that the marriage is valid under Colorado territorial law. The petition for annulment is denied. The courtroom erupted. Elena collapsed against Caleb, sobbing with relief. Vernon shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. This is a travesty. You'll demand nothing in my courtroom, Mr. Hale, Thornton said coldly. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the territorial prosecutor for investigation into possible criminal charges, including false imprisonment, assault through hired agents, and witness intimidation. Sheriff Coleman, you will conduct a thorough investigation of the cellar on Mr. Hale's property and document any evidence of wrongdoing. Your Honor, you can't, Garrison began. I can and I will. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell for the last time, and Caleb and Elena sat in the midst of chaos, holding each other as the reality settled over them. They'd won. Against all odds, against money and power and influence, they'd won. But looking at Vernon's face across the courtroom, seeing the cold fury there, the promise of vengeance, Caleb knew this wasn't over. The judge had ruled in their favor, but Vernon Hale was the kind of man who never accepted defeat. He'd find another way to hurt them, another angle to attack from. The war wasn't over. They'd just won the first real battle. They left the courthouse through a crowd that parted like water around rock, some faces showing genuine happiness for their victory, others displaying the careful neutrality of people who'd backed the wrong side and were reassessing their loyalties. Margaret Winters caught Elena's arm as they passed, tears streaming down her face. You did it, she whispered. You beat him. We did it, Elena corrected, pulling the older woman into a fierce embrace. Thank you for being brave enough to speak. I know what it cost you. My sister's loan came through this morning, Margaret said quietly. The bank approved the extension before the hearing even started. Turns out Vernon's threats were empty. He didn't control everything after all. They parted with promises to stay in touch, and Caleb guided Elena toward their horse, eager to leave before Vernon could manufacture some new crisis. But Sheriff Coleman intercepted them at the courthouse steps, his expression grim. Mr. Hart, Mrs. Hart. I need you to accompany me to Mr. Hale's property, judge's orders. I'm to document the cellar and any evidence of imprisonment, and I'd like you present to verify what you saw. Caleb felt Elena stiffen beside him. The thought of returning to that place, of descending into that darkness again, even with witnesses and daylight, it was asking too much. Is it necessary? Caleb asked. Can't you investigate without us? I could, but Vernon's already claiming the cellar was never secured the way you described, that you fabricated the whole story. Having you there to point out specific details would strengthen any potential case against him. Elena took a shaky breath. I'll go. If it means Vernon faces real consequences, I'll go back down there. You don't have to. Yes, I do. Otherwise, he'll keep claiming I'm a liar, and some people will always believe him. I need to prove it happened exactly as I said. So they rode together to Vernon's estate, this time accompanied by Sheriff Coleman and 2 deputies, plus a clerk to take official notes. The grand house looked different in daylight, less ominous, more pathetic somehow, like a costume that had lost its power to frighten once you understood it was just fabric and thread. Vernon was nowhere to be seen, though one of his lawyers stood on the porch with a document claiming this search was illegal and would be challenged. Coleman ignored him and led the group around to the back of the property where the cellar doors waited, now hanging open from when Caleb had broken them apart. Elena stopped 10 feet away, her face going pale. Caleb moved to her side, ready to support her if she needed to leave, but she straightened her spine and walked forward. The daylight revealed what Caleb's lantern had only hinted at, a stone cellar perhaps 12 feet by 12 feet, with walls that wept moisture and a floor of packed dirt. A bucket in one corner that had served as a toilet, a thin blanket crusted with filth, and there, still scattered on the ground, pieces of the shattered lock and sections of the chain Caleb had unwrapped. Coleman picked up the chain carefully, examining it. This is heavy gauge, the kind you'd use for securing valuable equipment or livestock, not wine storage. Vernon claimed he was protecting his wine collection, Elena said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. But there's no wine here. There never was. There's just the hole he threw me in when I wouldn't obey. The clerk was writing furiously, documenting everything. One of the deputies had found scratches on the wooden door, marks Elena had made trying to force it open from inside, her fingernails worn bloody against unforgiving wood. "How long were you down here?" Coleman asked gently. "I lost count. 8 weeks, maybe more. At first, Vernon brought food and water every few days, just enough to keep me alive. Then he stopped coming as often. Toward the end, I went maybe 4 or 5 days without seeing him." "That's attempted murder," one of the deputies said quietly. "Leaving someone to starve in a locked cellar. That's not discipline or guardianship. That's trying to kill someone slowly." Coleman nodded grimly. "I'll need you to document everything you remember, Mrs. Hart. Dates, if you can recall them, what Vernon said when he came down here, any threats he made." "He said I'd stay until I learned my place, that young women needed to be broken like horses, and he had all the time in the world to break me properly." Elena's voice caught. "He said if I died down here, he'd tell everyone I'd run away, and no one would question him because he was Vernon Hale and I was just a disobedient girl." The lawyer on the porch was protesting loudly about the search, about illegal evidence collection, about violations of Mr. Hale's rights. But even he seemed shaken by what they were uncovering, by the stark reality of that cellar and what it represented. They spent an hour documenting everything, taking measurements, collecting pieces of the lock and chain as evidence. By the time they finished, Elena was exhausted but somehow lighter, like the act of making her imprisonment official and undeniable had lifted a weight she'd been carrying since the moment Caleb had pulled her into the light. "This is enough for charges," Coleman said as they emerged from the cellar. "False imprisonment at minimum, possibly attempted murder depending on how the prosecutor wants to argue it, combined with Thorne's testimony about the assault and Vernon's threats in open court. He's going to face real consequences." "When?" Caleb asked. "That's up to the territorial prosecutor. Could be weeks, could be months. These things move slow, especially when the accused has money for expensive lawyers." "So Vernon stays free while the law decides whether what he did was criminal enough to matter?" Coleman's expression was sympathetic but firm. "That's how the system works. But he won't come near Elena again, I'll make sure of that. And his reputation in this town is destroyed. That counts for something." It counted for something, but it wasn't justice. Not real justice. Vernon would hire lawyers who'd delay and obfuscate, would argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that Elena had been free to leave at any time, that the whole thing was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. And maybe he'd be convicted, or maybe he'd walk away with nothing but a damaged reputation and the knowledge that he'd almost gotten away with it. They rode back to the ranch in silence, both processing what had just happened. The sun was high and warm despite the October chill, and the mountains looked peaceful against the brilliant blue sky. It should have felt like victory, and it did partially, but it also felt incomplete, like they'd won the battle, but the war was still raging somewhere just out of sight. That evening, as Caleb was tending to the horses, a rider appeared on the road. Caleb reached for his rifle by instinct, but relaxed when he recognized Reverend Matthews on his sturdy bay mare. "Reverend!" Caleb called in greeting. "What brings you out this way?" Matthews dismounted with the stiffness of a man who'd spent too many hours in the saddle. "I heard about the judge's ruling. Wanted to come congratulate you both and see how you were holding up." Elena emerged from the house, wiping her hands on an apron. Her face lit up when she saw the Reverend. "Thank you for coming, and thank you for testifying. Your words meant everything." "I only spoke the truth as I saw it. You two made vows before witnesses, and those vows were genuine. No court should have the power to unmake what was made in good faith." He paused, studying them both. but I suspect that's not the only reason I felt called to visit today. They invited him inside, and over coffee and the bread Elena had learned to bake, Matthews spoke about what he'd heard in town. Vernon was preparing to leave Cedar Ridge, selling off his property and business interests in a hurry that suggested either fear of prosecution or rage at his public humiliation. Several of his business partners had already distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with a man accused of imprisoning his stepdaughter. There's also talk, Matthews said carefully, about other victims, women who worked for Vernon or had dealings with him over the years. Margaret Winters wasn't exaggerating when she said Elena wasn't the first. There are stories coming out now that people were too afraid to tell before. Will any of them press charges? Caleb asked. Most won't. Too much time has passed, too little proof, too much fear of retaliation. But the stories are spreading, and that matters. Vernon's power came from his reputation, and that reputation is ashes now. Elena set down her coffee cup with trembling hands. I want to do something. Something to make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to other women. But I don't know what. Matthew smiled gently. I think you already know. You just need permission to admit it. Over the next hour, with the Reverend's encouragement and Caleb's support, Elena began articulating a dream she'd barely let herself imagine. A school, not just for children, though they'd be welcome, but specifically for young women who needed education and protection. A place where girls could learn to read and write and think, where they could understand their rights under the law, where they could develop skills that would give them independence and choices. It would need funding, Caleb said practically. A building, teachers, supplies. Start small, Matthews suggested. Use the church hall on weekdays. I can provide space and help with initial funding. And I suspect once word spreads about what you're doing, others will contribute. This town has good people in it, people who were horrified by what Vernon did. They'll want to help prevent it from happening again. The idea took root that night and grew with astonishing speed over the following weeks. Elena started with just 3 students, daughters of ranchers who wanted their girls educated beyond basic reading and arithmetic. She taught them literature and mathematics, history and law, but also practical skills like how to manage money, how to understand contracts, how to recognize manipulation and coercion. The school grew. Within a month, she had 7 students. Within 3 months, 15. Women brought their daughters, and some brought themselves, widows and young wives who'd never had access to real education, who wanted to understand the world beyond what men told them. Caleb watched his wife transform from the terrified girl he'd found in the cellar into someone extraordinary. She was a natural teacher, patient and encouraging but demanding too, refusing to let her students settle for less than their best. And she taught them something beyond academics. She taught them dignity, showed them through her own example that surviving trauma didn't mean being defined by it. The ranch prospered too, though not in ways Caleb had originally envisioned. He'd imagined building a cattle operation, becoming prosperous through livestock and land. Instead, the ranch became a different kind of enterprise, a place where Elena's students could see what self-sufficiency looked like, where they could learn practical skills alongside their academic studies. Vernon's promised retaliation never materialized in any dramatic way. He left Cedar Ridge 6 weeks after the hearing, selling his grand house to a mining company from Denver. Word filtered back occasionally. He'd relocated to San Francisco, then to Chicago, always moving like a man running from his reputation. The territorial prosecutor eventually dropped the criminal charges, citing insufficient evidence and the difficulty of prosecuting a case when the accused had left the jurisdiction. It wasn't justice, but it was victory of a sort. Vernon Hale had been driven from the community he'd terrorized, his power broken, his name synonymous with cruelty. Winter came hard and early that year, blanketing the valley in snow that made travel difficult and isolation inevitable. Caleb and Elena spent long evenings by the fire, reading or talking or simply sitting in comfortable silence. The awkwardness of their arranged marriage had faded into something deeper and more complex. Not romance exactly, but genuine partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. One night in late December, with wind howling outside and frost creeping across the windows, Elena looked up from the book she was reading. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, quietly. "Helping me? Marrying me? Everything that followed." Caleb considered the question seriously. His life had become completely different from what he'd imagined when he stepped off that train in October. He'd come to Colorado planning to disappear into anonymity, to build a simple ranch and leave his past behind. Instead, he'd become embroiled in a public battle, had married a stranger, had helped establish a school that was changing the community in small but significant ways. "No," he said finally. "I don't regret any of it. Do you?" "I regret Vernon. I regret the cellar and everything that led to it. But this," she gestured at the small house, at the life they'd built together. "I don't regret this at all. Even though it started from something terrible, it grew into something good." Spring brought new challenges and new growth. Elena's school had outgrown the church hall, and the community came together to build a proper schoolhouse on land donated by a rancher whose daughter was one of Elena's most dedicated students. The building was simple but sturdy, with large windows that filled the single room with light and a small apartment in back where Elena could work on lesson plans. Caleb helped with the construction, working alongside men who'd once viewed him with suspicion but now accepted him as one of their own. He'd proven himself through the hardest test frontier communities recognized. He'd stood up for what was right when it would have been easier to walk away. That earned respect no amount of money or influence could buy. On a warm day in May, 7 months after the hearing that had secured Elena's freedom, Margaret Winters arrived with her 3 children and a proposal. Her sister's ranch was struggling despite the loan extension, and Margaret wondered if Elena might need help at the school, another teacher, someone to manage the practical aspects, while Elena focused on curriculum and instruction. Elena hired her on the spot, and the school doubled in scope almost overnight. Margaret taught practical skills, sewing, cooking, household management, while Elena focused on academics and what she'd started calling practical feminism, teaching young women to understand their legal rights and economic options. The partnership worked beautifully, 2 women who'd survived Vernon Hale's cruelty channeling that experience into preventing others from suffering similarly. And Margaret's children flourished in the school environment, especially her eldest daughter, who showed remarkable aptitude for mathematics and writing. Summer brought its own milestone. Edgar Thorne visited, traveling from Denver specifically to see how Elena and Caleb were doing. He looked older, more worn, but there was peace in his expression that hadn't been there during the trial. "I wanted you to know," he told them over dinner, "that testifying against Vernon was the best decision I've made in years. It cost me business relationships and some social standing, but it gave me back my self-respect. I'm done making compromises with my conscience for the sake of profit." He'd brought a substantial donation for the school and a promise to fund scholarships for students who couldn't afford the modest tuition Elena charged. "Consider it penance," he said with a self-deprecating smile, "or investment in a better future. Either way, use it however you see fit." As summer turned to autumn, marking a full year since Caleb had first arrived in Cedar Ridge, Elena turned 18. The day passed with little fanfare, just a small celebration with the school's students and staff, cake and music and laughter filling the schoolhouse. That evening, Elena and Caleb sat on their porch watching the mountains turn gold in the setting sun, exactly as they had dozens of times before. But tonight felt different, weighted with significance. "I'm 18 now," Elena said quietly, "legally an adult, free of Vernon's guardianship completely." "Yes, which means our agreement about the marriage being temporary, about getting an annulment when I came of age. That's still an option if you want it." Caleb had known this conversation was coming, had thought about it during countless quiet moments over the past months. They'd married for practical reasons, for legal protection and survival. But somewhere along the way, practicality had transformed into something else. "Do you want an annulment?" he asked. Elena was quiet for a long moment, watching the light fade from the sky. "I've been thinking about that, about what I want versus what makes sense versus what's expected. And I realized something." "What's that?" "I'm happy. Genuinely happy. Maybe for the first time in my life. I love teaching, love the school, love the life we've built together. And I don't want to change it just because the legal necessity has passed. Neither do I." She turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the sunset's gold. "So where does that leave us?" "Partners," Caleb said, "like we've been all along." Whether we stay married or get an annulment, that's just paperwork. What matters is that we choose to keep building this life together. And if someday one of us wants something different, if you meet someone you actually want to marry for love, or if I decide I need independence, then we'll figure it out together. Honestly and with respect for each other. No chains, no cages, no one forced to stay where they don't want to be. Elena smiled, and it transformed her face entirely. I think I'd like to stay married. Not because I have to, but because I want to. Because you're my best friend and my partner, and marriage feels like the right word for what we are to each other. Even if it's not a traditional marriage, especially because it's not traditional, we get to define it ourselves, make it whatever works for both of us. They shook hands solemnly, sealing the agreement, and then laughed at the absurdity of shaking hands with your spouse. But it felt right, felt honest. A partnership freely chosen by two people who'd started in darkness and built their way to light. The second winter was easier than the first. The ranch was well prepared, the school continued through the cold months, and Elena and Caleb had settled into routines that accommodated both their work and their relationship. They were partners in the truest sense, each supporting the other's goals and dreams while maintaining their individual autonomy. News reached them in February that Vernon Hale had died in Chicago. Pneumonia, the letter said, complicated by excessive drinking and what the doctor had delicately termed a decline in moral character. He'd left no will, no family, no one who cared enough to claim his body for burial. Elena received the news in silence, her expression unreadable. Caleb waited, giving her space to feel whatever she needed to feel. I thought I'd be happy, she said finally, or at least relieved, but I just feel empty. Like all that fear and anger I carried had nowhere to go anymore. What do you want to do? Nothing. Let him be buried wherever they bury people no one claims. He doesn't deserve my grief or my forgiveness or even my anger. He deserves to be forgotten. So they let Vernon Hale fade into obscurity, a cautionary tale told in whispers but not dwelt upon. The school continued to grow, the ranch prospered in its modest way, and life moved forward with the relentless momentum of seasons changing and years passing. 3 years after that first night when Caleb heard Elena's cries in the darkness, the school had expanded to include boarding facilities for students from distant ranches, a small library funded by donations from across the territory, and satellite programs in 3 neighboring towns. Elena had become something of a local celebrity, the young woman who'd survived Vernon Hale's cruelty and transformed her trauma into something that helped others. She deflected the praise, insisting she was just one person among many working toward the same goals. But Caleb saw the impact she had on her students, the way young women left her school standing taller, thinking more clearly, understanding that they had choices and rights and power they'd never imagined before. On a summer evening, much like the one when Elena had turned 18, they sat on their porch watching the familiar mountains paint themselves in sunset colors. The house had been expanded, still modest but comfortable now, with a proper bedroom and a study where Elena could work on curriculum and Caleb could manage the ranch's accounts. Do you ever think about that first night? Elena asked. About what would have happened if you'd ignored my cries, if you'd decided it wasn't your problem? Sometimes. Usually when I'm trying to sleep and my mind won't settle. What do you think would have happened to me? Caleb didn't want to answer honestly, but he'd promised her truth always. I think Vernon would have killed you eventually. Maybe not intentionally, but through neglect or in a rage. And he would have gotten away with it because people like him always do. But you didn't let that happen. No. Why? And don't say it was just about doing the right thing. I know you better than that now. There was something else, something that made you willing to risk everything for a stranger. Caleb thought about how to explain it, about the brother he'd failed to protect when they were children, about the guilt that had followed him across territories and through years, about the desperate need to prove he could be brave when it mattered, that he could choose courage over safety. I had a younger brother, he said finally. Thomas. When I was 15 and he was 12, we were working our father's ranch in Kansas. There was an accident. A horse spooked, kicked him in the head. He was hurt bad, bleeding and unconscious. And I froze. Just stood there while he bled, too scared to move, too overwhelmed to help. Caleb, my father found us eventually.
got Thomas to a doctor. He survived, but he was never the same. Brain damage from the injury and from how long he'd gone without help. And I knew it was my fault.
If I'd acted faster, gotten help sooner, maybe he'd have been all right. You were 15, a child yourself. Old enough to know better. Old enough to have acted instead of freezing. He paused, the old guilt washing over him. Thomas died 2 years later, fever, but really from complications of that original injury. And I've spent every day since wondering what kind of man freezes when someone needs help. What kind of coward puts his own fear above someone else's life? Elena took his hand, her grip firm and warm. You're not that person anymore. Maybe you never were. Maybe you were just a frightened boy who made a mistake. But the man who heard me crying in the dark, who risked everything to pull me out, that man is brave and good and exactly who I needed him to be. I heard you crying, and I couldn't freeze again. Couldn't be that scared boy who did nothing. I had to prove I'd changed, that I could be better. And you were. You are. She leaned against his shoulder, comfortable and trusting. We saved each other, I think. I gave you the chance to be the person you wanted to be, and you gave me the freedom to become who I am. They sat in silence as the sun disappeared behind the mountains and stars began emerging in the darkening sky. The wind carried the sound of laughter from the schoolhouse where Margaret was hosting an evening study session for older students. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and the familiar sounds of the ranch settling for night created a symphony of home. I'm glad you didn't freeze that night, Elena said softly. So am I. 5 years. 10 years. The time passed in the way time does when life is full and meaningful, simultaneously too fast and perfectly paced. The school became an institution, sending graduates into teaching positions and business ventures across the territory and beyond. Elena's methods were studied and replicated by educators who recognized that teaching young women to think critically and understand their rights was revolutionary work disguised as simple education. Caleb's ranch remained modest but successful, known more for the community it supported than for its livestock production. He and Elena never had children of their own, but they raised dozens through the school, providing stability and guidance to girls who had nowhere else to turn. Their marriage remained unconventional by frontier standards. They shared a home and a life, but maintained separate bedrooms, separate interests, and the kind of independence most married couples never achieved. Some people gossiped about the arrangement, speculating about the true nature of their relationship, but most recognized what Caleb and Elena understood completely, that love came in many forms, and theirs was built on respect and partnership rather than romance. On the 20th anniversary of the night Caleb had found Elena in the cellar, they stood together at a dedication ceremony for the new school building, a proper 2-story structure with multiple classrooms, a library, and dormitories for boarding students. The territorial governor attended, praising Elena's work and announcing a grant to expand the program statewide. Elena gave a short speech, talking about education as liberation and the importance of ensuring that young women understood their worth and potential. She didn't mention Vernon Hale by name, but everyone understood the context, understood that this school, this work, this life she'd built was the ultimate refutation of everything he'd tried to do to her. After the ceremony, after the crowds dispersed and the dignitaries returned to their hotels, Elena and Caleb walked back to their ranch as the sun set over the familiar mountains. They were both older now, marked by the years but strong in the ways that mattered. Do you ever wonder how different our lives would have been if that train had brought you to a different town? Elena asked. If you'd bought land somewhere else, if you'd never heard me crying? Sometimes. But then I think about all the things that had to happen exactly right for us to end up here. Every decision, every coincidence, every choice, they all led to that moment. Fate? Maybe, or just luck. Either way, I'm grateful for it. Elena smiled, the expression carrying 2 decades of shared history and hard-won peace. Me too. Even knowing what it cost, even remembering the darkness, I'm grateful it led to this. They reached the ranch as full dark settled over the valley. Light spilled from windows that had once been dark and empty, and the sounds of students at evening study drifted from the school building. It was home in the deepest sense, not just a place, but a life built deliberately and with purpose. That night, sitting by the fire as they had countless times before, Caleb thought about the question Elena had asked years ago, whether he ever regretted helping her. The answer was still no, would always be no. Because that one choice, made in darkness and fear, had led to everything good in his life. It had given him purpose and partnership, had transformed his guilt into redemption, had shown him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Elena fell asleep in her chair, a book open on her lap, her face peaceful in the firelight. Caleb watched her for a moment, this woman who'd survived hell and built heaven from the ashes. Then he banked the fire, draped a blanket over her shoulders, and settled into his own chair with the comfortable routine of 20 years together. Outside, the Colorado wind sang through the valley, carrying the promise of another day, another season, another year of the life they'd built from nothing but determination and hope. Vernon Hale was long dead and mostly forgotten. The cellar where Elena had been imprisoned had been filled in and covered, erased from the landscape, though never quite from memory. But the school stood bright and growing, sending educated women into a world that desperately needed them. The ranch remained a sanctuary for those who needed refuge and support, and Caleb and Elena continued their partnership, proving every day that the bonds forged in crisis could become the foundation for something lasting and beautiful. The mountains stood eternal against the stars, witnesses to all the small dramas and large transformations that played out in the valleys below. And in a modest ranch house at the edge of Cedar Ridge, two people who'd found each other in darkness slept peacefully, surrounded by the life they'd built and the future they'd helped create. It had started with a scream in the night, desperate and terrified and refusing to be silenced. It had transformed into something neither of them could have imagined that first night. Not a rescue and not a fairy tale, but a real partnership between two people who'd chosen courage when it would have been easier to choose safety. And that, in the end, was enough. More than enough. It was everything.